and princely Azaria could abuse. Zimri, we know, he had no cause to praise, because he dubbed him with the name of Bays. Revenge on him did bitter venom shed, because he tore the laurel from his head, because he durst with his proud wit engage, and brought his follies on the public stage. Tell me, Apollo, for I can't divine, why wives he cursed and praised the concubine, unless it were that he had led his life with a teeming matron ere she was a wife, or that at best with his dear muse did suit, who was for hire a very prostitute. He also stepped forward to break a lance with our author on the subject of Shaftesbury's acquittal, and answered the medal by a very stupid poem called The Medal Reversed. To all this scurrilous doggerel, Dryden only replied by the single couplet above quoted. He calls Mephibosheth the wizard's son, because the Reverend John Portage, vicar of Bradfield in Berkshire, and father of the poet Samuel, was ejected from his cure by the commissioners of Berkshire for conversation with evil spirits, and for blasphemy, ignorance, scandalous behavior, devilism, uncleanness, and heaven knows what his case of insufficiency is among the state trials, from which he seems to have been a crazy enthusiast who believed in a correspondence with genii and demons. Samuel Portage was a member of the Society of Lincolns, and he wrote 3 plays, namely the Troads, translated from Seneca, Herod, and Mariamne, and the Siege of Babylon. He also published a romance called Iliana, and prepared a new edition of God's Revenge Against Murder, which was published after his death. Portage was moreover author of heroic stanzas on His Majesty's coronation, 1661, and probably of other occasional pieces deservedly doomed to oblivion. Note Roman 14, shun rotten uzza, as I would the pox be. 331. Jack Hole ranked as a sort of third-rate poet and courtier among the minor wits of the time in the essay on satire. He is mentioned as a companion of little Sid, for simile renowned, whether we suppose Sidley or Sidney to be represented under that character, as they were both at present in the country party. It is possible that Jack Hole went into opposition with his friend and admirer C. The note upon Hole appended to the essay on satire. Note Roman 15 Dogue, though without knowing how or why, made still a blundering kind of melody. P. 330. 1. Elkanah Settle, whose original quarrel with our author is detailed in the introductory remarks to their prose controversy, had now further incensed him by tergiversation in politics. For Elkanah, although originally a Tory, was induced probably by his connections as poet laureate for the city to go over to the party of Monmouth and Shaftesbury. His new friends made use of his talents in a twofold capacity. Shaftesbury employed him to write a pamphlet in favor of the exclusion, entitled The Character of a Popish Successor. When Settle afterwards recanted, he said this piece, which made some noise at the time, was retouched by his noble friend in Aldersgate Street, whose only objection was that it was not sufficiently violent in favor of insurrection. Settle, having a mechanical turn, was also employed as chief engineer at the solemn Pope burning, which we have so often mentioned, in which charge he acquitted himself much to the satisfaction of his employers. On account of his literary and mechanical merits, Sir Roger L'Estrange allots him the double office of poet laureate and master of the ordnance to the Whig faction in the following passage of a dialogue between Jest and Earnest. Jest, for instance, I knew a lusty fellow who would not willingly be thought valiant, who has an indifferent hand at making of crackers, serpents, rockets, and the other playthings that are proper on the 5th of November, and has for such his skill received applause and victuals from the munificent gentlemen about Templibar. Earnest, and he ill warrant, is made master of the ordnance. Jest true, and I think him very fit for it, but he's like to have another employment of a strangely different nature, for because this dull wretch once upon a time wrote a fulsomely nonsensical poem, in prose being a character of a bugbear, he forsooth is designed poet laureate too. Earnest, these two offices, as you say, one would think should require diverse accomplishments, but then it may be said that these may well enough be supplied by one man, the poet, to make ballads in peace, and betake himself to his other business in war. Jest, nay, his squibs and his poems have much what the same fortune they crack and bounce, and the boys and girls laugh at them. Earnest, well, how great are the advantages, I thought the author of the satiric work, upon the observator and Heraclitus, or the person of honor, that obliged the peafolks with poetical reflections upon Absalom and Achitophel. I say I thought these forsaken scribblers might have bid fairest for the evergreen twig. Just I thought so too, but hunger will break stone walls. Elk promises to vindicate Lucifer's first rebellion. For a few guineas poor Absalom and Achitophel must e'en hide themselves in the Old Testament again, and I question whether they'll be safe there from the fury of this mighty cacodogan. Earnest, silly chit, has he not learned the apologue of the serpent and the file, but fare him well Heraclitus redens no 50. From the last part of this passage, it appears that Settle was then laboring upon his answer to Absalom and Achitophel, for which Dryden condemned him to a disgraceful immortality. At length, he came forth with Absalom senior or Achitophel transposed. In this piece, Dryden's plan is followed by applying the names and history of Scripture to modern persons and events. Thus Queen Elizabeth is Deborah, and Sir Francis Drake Barak. The Papists are the worshippers of Baal, and the Duke of York is Absalom. This circumstance did not escape the wit of Dryden, who says of Settle in the text, "For almonds held cry whore to his own mother, or call young Absalom King David's brother." Indeed, Elkanah seems himself to have been sensible of the absurdity of this personification, by which the king's brother, almost as old as himself, was converted into the blooming son of David, and apologizes in his preface, addressed to the Tories for the freedom of clapping, but about a score of years extraordinary on the back of Absalom. Neither is it, he continues, altogether so unpardonable a poetical license, since we find as great slips from the author of Your Own Absalom, where we see him bring in a Zimri into the court of David, who in the scripture story died by the hand of Phinehas in the days of Moses. Nay, in the 376 other extreme, we find him in another place, talking of the martyrdom of Stephen so many ages after. And if so famous an author can forget his own rules of unity, time, and place, I hope you'll give a minor poet some grains of allowance. Sir E. Godfrey's murder is disguised under that of Amnon Tamar's rape, being explained the discovery of the plot. Baal's cabinet intrigues he open spread, the ravished Tamar for whose sake he bled. As Settle's poems have long fallen into total oblivion, from which his name has only been rescued by the satirical pen of Dryden, and as he was once thought no unequal rival for that great poet, the reader may be curious to see a specimen of his style. I have therefore inserted the few of the leading characters of Absalom Senior, in which he has rhymed and rattled with most tolerable success. Duke of Monmouth. In the first rank the youthful Ithrim stood, his princely veins filled with great David's blood, with so much manly beauty in his face, scarce his high birth could lend a nobler grace, and for a mind fit for this shrine of gold, heaven cast his soul in the same beauteous mold, with all the sweets of prideless greatness blessed, and affable as Abraham's angel guest. Shaftesbury, that second Moses guide, resolved to free our Israel from her threatening slavery, idolatry and chains, both from the rods of Pharaoh masters and Egyptian gods. Such are Barzillai, but Barzillai too, with Moses' fate does Moses' zeal pursue, leads to that bliss which his own silver hairs shall never reach, rich only to his heirs. Kind patriot, who to plant us banks of flowers, with purling streams, cool shades, and summer bowers, his age's needful rest away does fling, exhausts his autumn to adorn our spring, while his last hours in toils and storms are hurled, and only to enrich the inheriting world, thus prodigally throws his life's short span, to play his country's generous pelican. The ungainly appearance, uncouth delivery, and versatile politics of the famous Duke of Lauderdale are thus described. Let not that hideous bulk of honor scape, Nadab that sets the gazing crowd agape, that old kirk founder whose coarse croak could sing The saints the cause, no bishop and no king. When greatness cleared his throat and scoured his maw, roared out succession and the penal law. To Absalom's side does his old covenant bring, with state raised out and interlined with king. Jeffreys of Loburn tools we bawling Shimei saw, Jerusalem's late loud-tongued mouth of law. By blessings from almighty bounty given, Shimei no common favourite of heaven, whom lest posterity should lose the breed. In 5 short moons indulgent heaven raised seed, made happy in an early teeming bride, and laid a lovely heiress by her side. But as was reasonably to be expected, Settle has exerted his whole powers of satire and poetry in the description of his antagonist Dryden, and here let me remark that almost all the adversaries of our author commence their attack by an unwilling compliment to his poetical powers. But Amiel had alas the fate to hear an angry poet play his chronicler, a poet raised above oblivion's shade, by his recorded verse immortal made. But sir, his livelier figure to engrave, with branches added to the bays you gave, no muse could more heroic feats rehearse, had with an equal all-applauding verse great David's scepter and Saul's javelin praised, a pyramid to his saint in trust raised, for which religiously no change he missed, from commonwealth's man up to royalist, nay would have been his own loathed thing called priest, which with so much gall he does describe, cause once unworthy thought of Levis tribe, near those bright towers where art has wonders done, and at his feet proud Jordan's waters run, where David's sight glads the blessed summer's sun. A cell there stands by pious founders raised, both for its wealth and learned rabbins praised. To this did an ambitious bard aspire, to be no less than lord of that blessed choir, till wisdom deemed so sacred a command, a prize too great for his unhallowed hand. Besides lewd fame had told his plighted vow, to Laura's cooing love perched on a drooping bough, Laura in faithful constancy confined, to Ethiop's envoy and to all mankind. Laura though rotten, yet of mould divine, he had all her, and she had all his coin, her wit so far his purse and sense could drain, till every was sweetened to a strain. And if at last his nature can reform, as weary grown of love's tumultuous storm, 'tis age's fault, not his, of power bereft. He left not whoring, but of that was left. Settle's end was utterly inglorious. In 1683 he deserted the cause of the Whigs, and returned to that of the Tories, for whom he wrote several periodical tracts, in one of which, entitled A Narrative, he accused his old patron Shaftesbury of correcting the famous character of a popish successor, and objecting that it did not speak favourably enough of rebellion, whether compelled by poverty or through zeal for the royal cause. He became a trooper in King James's army when it was encamped on Hounslow Heath. Finally, he took the prophetic hint conveyed in Dryden's lines, and became not indeed the master, but the assistant to a puppet show kept by a Mrs. Minns in Bartholomew Fair. Thus the expression which Dryden had chiefly used in contemptuous allusion to the share which Settle had in directing the Pope burning, and the fireworks which accompanied it, was literally fulfilled. Nay, poor Elkanah in his old age was 379 at length, obliged not only to write for the puppet show, but to appear in it as a performer enclosed in a case representing a green dragon of his own proper device. There are few readers who need to be reminded of Pope's famous lines. Yet lo in me, what authors have to brag on, reduced at last to hiss in my own dragon. Avert it, heaven, that thou my Cibber ear shouldst wag a serpentale in Smithfield Fair. In the close of life, this veteran scribbler found admission to the Charterhouse, and in that hospital in the year 1724 died the rival of Dryden. In person, Elkanah Settle was tall, red-faced, and wore a satin cap over his short black hair. Note Romans 16, now stop your noses, readers, all and some. For here's a ton of midnight work to come. Og, from a treason tavern rolling, home p. 333. Our author had very shortly before the publication of the second part of Absalom and Achitophel made his enemy, Shadwell, the subject of a separate and cutting personal satire called Mac Flecknoe. That poem, as we have noticed in the introductory remarks, has reference principally to the literary character of his adversary, while in the lines which follow he considers him chiefly as a political writer and factionary of the popular party. Shadwell's corpulence, his coarse and brutal debauchery, his harsh and clumsy style of poetry fell under the lash on both occasions, and it is astonishing with what a burning variety of colors these qualities are represented. The history of his literary disputes with Dryden may be perused in the introduction to Mac Flecknoe in the Vindication of the Duke of Guise. Dryden has also given a severe flagellation to his corpulent adversary, in which he says that, although Shadwell has often called him an atheist in print, he believes more charitably of his antagonist, and that he only goes the broad way because the other is too narrow for him. Besides avenging abundance of personal abuse, Dryden, in the person of Shadwell, chastises a great supporter of the Whig cause and principles. Shadwell himself complains that in the days of Charles and James he was silenced for a nonconformist poet. He was the chief among the corrector men, as the authors and publishers of the Whig party were oddly entitled, and received the reward of his principles at the Revolution, succeeding, as is well known, our author in the office of poet laureate in the epilogue to the Volunteers, a play of Shadwell's acted after his death. The friends of the Revolution are called upon to applaud their favorite bard's last production. Crown you his last performance with applause, who love like him our liberties and laws. Let but the honest party do him right, and their loud claps will give him fame in spite of the faint hiss of grumbling Jacobite. Note Romans 17, these gloomy, thoughtful, and on mischief bent, while those for mere good fellowship frequent the appointed club can let sedition pass. Sense nonsense, anything to employ the Glaspie 335. The reader will find some account of the King's Head Club. Vol. Romans 7 p. 154 North gives the following lively account of the vulgar, as he calls them, of the popular faction. Their employ, according to him, was to run about whispering here and there, by which management they kept up the spirits of their fools, whose fire, without a continual pabulum of fresh news, talks, and hopes, would go out amongst these. The cues and hints went about honest, drunken, lying fellows, good company, and always dear friends. A nod with a wink had notable signification. If it followed, have patience, you shall see I know somewhat extraordinary will be done shortly, and soon, which will secure all on our side. And thus passively wicked were these underlings or fry of the party, they knew of the intrigue no more, and were concerned, as the wood of drums and the brass of trumpets are in the war. 439. The pastime of this meeting, called the club, was very engaging to young gentlemen, and one who had once tasted the conversation could scarcely ever quit it, for some or others were continually coming and going to import or export news or stories, as the trade required and afforded there. It was known in half an hour what any member said at the committee of elections, or in the House, if it sat late, and every post carried the news and tales legitimated there, as also the malign constructions of all the good actions of the government, especially to places where elections were depending to shape men's characters into fit qualifications to be chosen or rejected. The Pope himself could not make saints so readily as they papists, and so half three-quarter papists, as belief was prompt or difficult, and a lewd atheistical fellow was as readily washed clean, and made a zealous Protestant, for that genus of perfection was not wanted in this dispensation, where no vice, immorality, heresy, atheism, or blasphemous wit had not professors ready to embrace willing disciples, who for the sake of such sublimities of wit and sense, as they were accounted, were ready to prostitute all principles of duty, and especially those that regarded allegiance to the crown. The well-known distinction of this famous club was a green riband, in opposition to which the Tories wore in their hats a scarlet riband, with the motto Rex et, reads the prologue to Anna Bullen, very sensibly expostulates against these party badges. Wast not enough vain men of either side? Two roses once the nation did divide. But must it be in danger, now agen, betwixt the scarlet and green ribbon men? Note Roman 18, but in the sacred annals of our plot, industrious Arod never be forgot. The labors of this midnight magistrate may vie with Cora's to preserve the state. P. 335. Sir William Waller, son of the parliamentary general of the same name, distinguished himself during the time of the Popish plot by an uncommon decree of bustling activity. He was a justice of peace, and unawed by the supposed fate of his brother in the commission, and in knighthood Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey, he stood forth the bold investigator of this bottomless conspiracy. It was he who had the fortune, by the assistance of Captain Dangerfield, to detect what was called the meal-tub plot, which that fellow who had been trafficking with both factions, and probably meant to cheat both, chose to represent as a sham conspiracy, contrived to ruin Shaftesbury and his friends upon this occasion. Sir William had much closeting with a magnanimous midwife, called Mrs. Cellier, whom Dangerfield charged as an agent of the court, and who afterwards alleged that the knight took some uncommon means to extort confessions from her. Sir William Waller was also the person who discovered Fitzharris' plot, and he intimated that the king, who intended to turn it upon the Protestants, was so much displeased with his blowing up the project that he threatened to have him assassinated. The Tories alleged that the pleasure of making these discoveries was not Sir William's sole reward any more than zeal was his only motive for gutting the Popish chapels, in which, says North, he proceeded with such scandalous rigor as to bring forth the pictures and other furniture of great value, and burn them publicly, which gave occasion to suspect, and some said positively, that under this pretense he kept good things for himself. In a word, he was called the priest-catcher. Anthony Wood joins in the accusation of his rifling the papists' houses of goods, and appropriating chapel ornaments as Popish trinkets. I find that respectable person Miles Prance the witness enters into solemn vindication of the justice from the practices alleged by Northwood, and by the poet another damnable scandal they have broached, which though it be principally levelled at Sir William Waller, as if he under pretence of searching for priests and seizing Popish trinkets should take away money, plate, and other things of value from the owners, and necklaces of pearl for beads, yet since I very frequently went along with him, it does obliquely reflect upon me, and I cannot but do that worthy gentleman the right to justify him against such a most false, groundless, and malicious slander. I do therefore declare in the presence of God, and shall be ready to attest upon oath, that whensoever I attended him in searches, which was almost every day, I could never discover in him the least inclination to any such base practices, but that to the contrary, he behaved himself as a good Christian and just magistrate. For wherever we came, what money we found was left in the owner's possession. And as for chalices and pieces of plate belonging to priests and used in their mass, or for keeping of holy oil, we did indeed batter or break them to pieces, but always returned all the pieces to the proprietors, but their copes and priestly vestments, superstitious pictures, habits of monks belonging to their peculiar orders, and such like trumpery, we did sometimes take away, and cause them to be publicly burned, never making any advantage thereof. And as to any necklaces of pearl reported to be by him taken away, I am more than confident the same is as errand a lie, as that he thought one Bedingfield, whom he took at Newark, to have been the same Bedingfield who died in the gatehouse, for he well knew it was another man. Prance confirms this attestation by a special case, in which Sir William returned to a priest not only his money, but a silver tobacco box. Derrick mentions Sir William standing candidate in 1679 to be a member of Parliament, in which he failed, and adds that the publicans who trusted him found much ado to get their money. When the court party gained an ascendance, Sir William Waller was first struck out of the commission, and afterwards committed to prison. To the great triumph of the Tories, he afterwards went to Holland, and with Robert Ferguson and Bethel, is specially accepted from the general pardon granted after Monmouth's defeat. Ralph Val Roman 1 p. 918. Note Roman 19, who for their own defense give no supply, but what the crown's prerogatives must buy, as if their monarch's rights to violate more needful were, than to preserve the state. P. 336. The Whigs of those days had constant recourse to the desperate remedy of refusing supplies when dissatisfied with the court. This ultimate measure ought only to be adopted in cases of extremity, because the want of means to maintain the usual current expenses for the law and the defense of the country gives a perilous shock to the whole system of government. At that time, however, it was held so effectual a check and so necessary that the Whig citizens, in a paper of instructions furnished to their representatives in 16,801, having thanked them for their good service, more especially for their zeal for the exclusion bill, proceed to recommend that they would still literally pursue the same measures and grant no supplies to the crown till they saw themselves effectually secured from popery and arbitrary power. Note Roman 20, his absence David does with tears advise. To appease their rage undaunted, he complies. P. 337. In 16,789, when the plot hung like a comet over England, the king thought it necessary to assent to the counsel of the Earl of Danby and request the Duke of York to give way to the storm and silence the popular clamor by retreating for a season to the continent. The Duke requested a particular order lest it should be supposed he fled from a consciousness of guilt. The order was in these words: "I have already given you my resolution at large, why I think it fit that you absent yourself some time beyond the seas, as I am truly sorry for the occasion, so you may be sure I shall never desire it longer than it may be absolutely necessary for your good and my service. In the meantime, I think proper to give it you under my hand, that I expect this compliance from you, and desire it may be as soon as conveniently you may easily perceive with what trouble I write this to you, there being nothing I am more sensible of than the kindness you have ever had for me. I hope you are as just to me as to be assured that no absence nor anything else can ever change me from being truly and kindly yours, Roman 100 R. February 28, 16,789, superscribed for my most dear friend, the Duke of York. Authors differ concerning the store of parting tears which were shed on the separation of the royal brothers. Burnet says that the Duke wept much, but the king did not seem affected. Others affirm that both brothers testified much emotion. The Duke retired to Brussels, where he remained till the time of the king's illness, so often mentioned. Note Roman 21, dissembled patriots, bribed with Egypt's gold. Even Sanhedrims, in blind obedience, hold. P. 341. That Charles Roman II was a pensioner of France is now generally allowed, but though Louis was willing to afford the King of England such supplies as to save him from the necessity of throwing himself on his parliament, it was equally his policy to foster such opposition to him in that assembly as might totally engage the eyes of both parties upon domestic feuds, and withdraw them from marking his own ambitious strides towards universal power. For this, it was necessary that his minister Barillon should have an understanding with the leaders of the popular party. Hence, each faction as truly as loudly accused the other of the unworthy dependence on France, to which both were in secret reduced, an account of the French intrigues with the popular party, and of the money distributed among their chiefs, may be found in Dalrymple's Memoirs. Note Roman 22, from Hebron now, the suffering heir returned. A realm that long with civil discord mourned, till his approach, like some arriving god, composed and healed the place of his abode. P. 343. In some respects, the presence of the Duke of York in Scotland was very acceptable to the nobles and gentry of that kingdom. There is among Somers' tracts a letter from a person of quality in Scotland, who professes that although a zealous Protestant, he had been converted from his opinion in favor of the Bill of Exclusion by the personal knowledge of his very many excellencies and virtues. Doubtless many circumstances drew the Scots to the faction and favor of the Duke. They saw the halls of their ancient palace again graced with the appearance of royalty and occupied by a descendant of their long line of kings. The formal, grave, and stately decorum of James was more suitable to the manners of a proud, reserved, and somewhat pedantic people than the lighter manners of Charles. The proud as well as the ingenious know and feel the value of favors conferred by those who resemble them. York applied himself particularly to secure the personal attachment of the Highland chiefs and to staunch the feuds by which their clans were divided, he no doubt reckoned upon the assistance of these ready warriors, in case the sword had been drawn in England, but he little foresaw that the last hopes of his family were to depend on the generous attachment of the descendants of the chieftains whom he then cultivated, and that his race were to involve in their fall the ruin of the patriarchal and feudal power of these faithful adherents. But if the conduct of James in these particulars was laudable on the other hand, by introducing an inconsistent and absurd test into the law, by making it the means of ruining a loyal and innocent nobleman, the Earl of Argyll, by satiating his own eyes with the tortures inflicted on the Covenanters, gave tokens of that ill-judged and bigoted severity which was the cause of his being precipitated from the throne settle, gives a juster, if a less poetical account of the manner in which he spent his eggs. While sweating Absalom in Israel pent, for fresher air was to bleak Hebron sent. Cold Hebron, warmed by his approaching sight, flushed with his gold and glowed with new delight, till sacred, all-converting interest, to loyalty their almost unknown guest, oped a broad gate from whenceforth issuing come decrees, tests, oaths for well-soothed Absalom. Note Roman 23 Mongst, whom was Jothran always bent to serve the crown and loyal, by descent p. 343. Admiral Legge, created Earl of Dartmouth by Charles Roman II, and a particular friend of the Duke of York. When James came to the throne, he loaded Dartmouth with favours, and paid a singular testimony to the family loyalty celebrated in the text in 1687, while the Earl attended the King on his progress. The city of Coventry presented His Majesty with a massive gold cup, which he instantly delivered to Lord Dartmouth, telling him it was an acknowledgment from the city for the sufferings of his father, who had long lain in jail there on account of his adherence to the King. During the civil wars in the succeeding year, Dartmouth was made Admiral of the Fleet of England. He was perhaps the worthiest man and most faithful servant in the court of King James, whom he truly loved and served, though he disapproved of his arbitrary encroachments. Spoke his mind on the subject without fear or scruple, although a hereditary enemy of Lord Russell Dartmouth, had the generosity to interfere in his favour. He set sail from Torbay with the English fleet to intercept that of the Prince of Orange at the time of the Revolution. Had they met, a bloody action must have been the consequence, but God ordered it otherwise. The same wind which carried the Dutch fleet into Torbay forced back the English to the Downs, and before Dartmouth could again put to sea, the officers and sailors were as unwilling to resist the Prince of Orange as the nobles and land army. When Lord Dartmouth found it was entirely out of his power to serve King James, he called a council of war, and joined in an address to King William in 16,912. He was committed to the Tower on suspicion of holding correspondence with his old master. Note Roman 24, nor can Benaiah's worth forgotten lie, of steady soul when public storms were high, whose conduct, while the more fierce onsets made, secured at once our honour and our trade. p. 343. General Edward Sackville, a gentleman of good quality related to the Dorset family, who had served at Tangier with great reputation, both for courage and judgment, being a particular friend of the Duke of York. He expressed himself very contemptuously concerning the Popish conspiracy, saying they were sons of whores who believed there was a plot, and he was a lying rogue that said it. The Commons, being then in the very height of their fermentation on this subject, not only expelled Sackville from the House, but prepared an address to the King that he might be made incapable of holding any office. He was committed to the Tower, but shortly afterwards set free and restored to his military rank, though not to his seat in the House, after noticing Dartmouth, Sackville, and the other real friends of the Duke of York. The poet stigmatizes those concealed enemies who now affected to congratulate his return. Those who sought his absence to betray, press first their nauseous false respects to pay. Him still the officious hypocrites molest, and with officious duty break his rest. A marginal note on Luttrell's copy points out the Earl of Anglesea as particularly concerned in this sarcasm. In a prologue spoken before the Duke at his first appearance at the theatre after his return, Dryden is equally severe on these time-serving courtiers. Still we are thronged so full with Reynard's race, that loyal subjects scarce can find a place. Thus modest truth is cast behind the crowd. Truth speaks too low, hypocrisy too loud. Let them be first to flatter in success. Duty can stay, but guilt has need to press. Note Roman 25, who now an envious festival installs, and to survey their strength the faction calls, which fraud religious worship too must gild. But oh, how weakly does sedition build! For lo, the royal mandate issues forth, dashing at once their treason zeal and mirth. P. 346. The Duke of York maintained some interest in the city by being Captain General of the Artillery Company, who invited him to dine at Merchant Taylor's Hall on April 21, 1682. The party of Monmouth and Shaftesbury resolved to have a meeting in opposition to that which was proposed, and tickets at a guinea apiece, of which the following is a copy, were circulated among their adherents. It having pleased Almighty God by his wonderful providence to deliver and protect his Majesty's person, the Protestant religion, and English liberties hitherto from the hellish and frequent attempts of their enemies, the Papists, in testimony of thankfulness herein, and for the preserving and improving mutual love and charity among such as are sensible thereof, you are desired to meet many of the loyal Protestant nobility, gentry, clergy, and citizens on Friday, the 21st day of this instant, April 1682, at 10 of the clock, at St. Michael's Church in Cornhill, there to hear a sermon, and from thence to go to Haberdasher's Hall to dinner, and to bring this ticket with you. A sermon was accordingly prepared for this great occasion, and doubtless contained what is vulgarly called a touch of the times. All other preparations for this great entertainment were made with proper magnificence, but the design was utterly quashed by the following proclamation. Whitehall, April 19. His Majesty was pleased this afternoon to make the following order in council at the Court of Whitehall this 19th day of April 1682, by His Majesty and the Lords of His Majesty's most honorable Privy Council. Whereas the appointing of public fasts and thanksgiving is matter of state, and belongs only to His Majesty by his prerogative, and His Majesty being informed that in the City of London invitations have been made of great and unusual numbers by printed tickets, one of which is hereunto annexed, His Majesty looks upon the same as an insolent attempt in manifest derogation of his right, and of dangerous consequence, the matter of the said invitation being of a public nature, and the manner of carrying it on tending to sedition, and raising distinctions and confederacies among his subjects against the known laws and peace of the kingdom. His Majesty, therefore, by the advice of his council hath thought fit, and doth hereby strictly charge, and command the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of London, as they will answer the contrary at their peril, to take immediate and effectual care to prevent and hinder the said meeting as an unlawful assembly, and all sheriffs, constables, and others His Majesty's officers in the said city are hereby commanded to be aiding and assisting therein. This disappointment, trifling as it may seem, was of great disadvantage to the Whigs. It made them ridiculous, which is more fatal to a political party than any other misfortune, for few choose to belong to the faction who have the laugh against them. The Tory poets exulted in the opportunity of showing their wit, and we have perpetual allusions to this ludicrous incident in the fugitive pieces of the time, thus Otway in the prologue to The City Heiress, or Sir Timothy Treatle. This demon lately drew in many a guest, to part with zealous guinea for no feast, who but the most incorrigible fops, forever doomed in dismal cells called shops, to cheat and damn themselves to get their livings, would lay sweet money out in sham thanksgivings. Shamplots you may have paid for o'er and o'er, but who e'er paid for a sham treat before? In a congratulatory poem on the Whigs' entertainment, we have a similar strain of exultation, though I believe it is their ironical. Hollo, boys, hollo, hollo, once again. T'other half-crown shall then reward your pain. Alas, poor Whig, where wilt thou sneaking go? Thy wine is spilt, thy pies and cakes are dough. Down go the coppers, tables, shelves, and all. And so farewell to Haberdasher's Hall. The loyal feast, appointed to be kept in Haberdasher's Hall on Friday, the 21st of April 1682, by His Majesty's most loyal true blue Protestant subjects, and how it was defeated. The Whigs from north to south, from east to west, did all contribute to a loyal feast. To this great work a guinea was the least. They cleared the stalls of fish, flesh, fowl, and beast, where Tony and brave Perkin was a guest. But what succeeded this made up the jest. Tony was small, but of noble race, and was beloved of every one. He broached his tap, and it ran apace, to make a solemn treat for all the town. He sent to yeoman, knight, and lord, the holy tribe to entertain, with all the nation could afford. But Tony will never be himself again. With thanks and prayers for our good king, they vowed to solemnize the day. But royal Charles, he smoked the thing, and sent the rabble with a pox away. He sent his summons to the cit, seditious meetings to refrain. The feast was broke, and the guests were beshit, and Tony will never be himself again. And now the capons fly about, with fricassees of amber grice, and chickens ready dressed they shout about the street for pence apiece. The Whigs did wish the council choked, who did this noble feast restrain, all down in the mouth to be thus balked. Poor Tony will ne'er be himself again. Note Roman 26, first right Bezaleel, whose illustrious name forestals our praise and gives his poet fame. The Kenites' rocky province, his command p. 347. The Marquis of Worcester, Lord President of Wales, was a keen opponent of the Bill of Exclusion, insomuch that by a vote of the Commons in 1680 he was declared a favour of popery. Then an imputation of tremendous import, and an address was appointed to be preferred against him Halifax, Clarendon, and others as enemies too. The king and kingdom, it may be supposed that this was far from lowering the Marquis in the king's esteem. On the contrary, in 1682, he was created Duke of Beaufort. At the Duke of Monmouth's invasion, he commanded in Bristol, and was an effectual means of stopping his progress, for, when he approached that city which contained many of his partisans, the Duke of Beaufort, finding there was great danger of an insurrection in the place, declared that he would burn the town the instant he saw the slightest symptoms of disloyalty. When this was made known to Monmouth, he exclaimed, "God forbid I should be the means of exposing so noble a city to the double calamity of sword and fire." Accordingly, he instantly altered the direction of his march, leaving behind him that rich and populous city, which, if he could have carried it, contained men to increase his forces, stores to supply them, arms to equip them, and money to pay them. This proved a fatal indulgence of compassion. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. The Duke of Beaufort continued to be a friend to James, after by abdicating his throne he had ceased to be a friend to himself. He voted against William in the Convention Parliament, Lord Herbert of Ragland, the Duke's eldest son, in whom he saw all his glories copied, as the poet, as it was according to Wood, entered at Christ Church, Oxford, and took the degree of Master of Arts in 1681. An account of the Duke of Beaufort's noble housekeeping and mode of educating his family has been preserved by Roger North, and presents so curious a picture of the interior of a great family in the end of the 17th century that I think the reader will be pleased to see it. One year his lordship, the Lord Chief Justice North, afterwards Lord Keeper Guilford, concluding at Bristol, made a visit at Badminton to the Duke of Beaufort, and stayed about a week, for the Duke was descended from a North of his lordship's family, viz. One of the Lord Edward North's daughters, whom a lineal ancestor of his grace married. So besides conformity of principle with respect to the public, they were by this relation qualified for mutual respect and honor. I mention this entertainment as an handle of showing a princely way of living which that noble Duke used above any other, except crowned heads, that I have had notice of in Europe, and in some respects greater than most of them, to whom he might have been an example. He had above Roman 50 per annum in his hands, which he managed by stewards, bailiffs, and servants, and of that great part of the country which was his own lying round about him was part and the husbandmen Roman 100 were of his family, and provided for in his large expanded house, he bred all his horses, which came to the husbandry first colts, and from thence, as they were fit, were taken into his equipage, and as by age or accident they grew unfit for that service, they were returned to the place, from whence they came, and there expired, except what for plenty or unfitness were sold or disposed of. He had about 200 persons in his family, all provided for, and in his capital house 9 original tables covered every day, and for the accommodation of so many a large hall was built with a sort of alcove at one end for distinction, but yet the whole lay in the view of him that was chief, who had power to do what was proper for keeping order amongst them, and it was his charge to see it done. The tables were properly assigned, as for example the chief steward with the gentlemen, and pages the master of the horse, with the coachmen and liveries, an under steward with the bailiffs, and some husbandmen, the clerk of the kitchen with the bakers, brewers, Roman 100 altogether, and other more inferior people under these. In places apart the women had their dinning groom also, and were distributed in like manner my lady's chief woman, with the gentlewomen, the housekeeper with the maids, and some others. The method of governing this great family was admirable and easy, and such as might have been a pattern for any management whatever, for if the Duke or Duchess, who concerned herself much more than he did for every day of her life in the morning, she took her tour and visited every office about the house, and so was her own superintendent, observed anything amiss or suspicious, as a servant riding out, or the like, nothing was said to that servant, but his immediate superior, or one of an higher order, was sent for, who was to inquire and answer if leave had been given or not. If not, such servant was straight turned away. No fault of order was passed by, for it may be concluded, there are enough of them that pass undiscovered. All the provisions of the family came from foreign parts, as merchandise, soap and candle were made in the house, so likewise the malt was ground there, and all the drink that came to the Duke's table was of malt, sundried upon the leads of his house. Those are large, and the lanthorn is in the centre of an asterisk of glades, cut through the wood of all the country round 4 or 5 in a quarter, almost pert de view. Diverse of the gentlemen cut their trees and hedges to humour his vistos, and some planted their hills in his lines for compliment at their own charge. All the trees planted in his parks, and about, were fenced with a dry wall of stone, taken out where the tree was set. And with all this menagerie and provision, no one that comes and goes for visits or affairs with the Duke, who was Lord Lieutenant of 4 or 5 counties, and Lord President of Wales, that could observe anything more to do there than in any other nobleman's house. So little of vain ostentation was to be seen there at the entrance, where coaches ordinarily came in. The Duke built a neat dwelling house, but pompous stables, which would accommodate 40 horses, as well as the best stables he had. This was called the inn, and was contrived for the ease of the suitors, as I may call them, for instead of half a crown to his servants, at taking horse 6pence, there for form served the turn, and no servant of his came near a gentleman's horse, but they were brought by their own servants, except such as lodged, whose equipages were in his own stables. As for the Duke and Duchess and their friends, there was no time of the day without diversion. Breakfast in her gallery that opened into the gardens, then perhaps a deer was to be killed, or the gardens and parks, with the several sorts of deer to be visited, and if it required mounting, horses of the Duke's were brought for all the company. And so in the afternoon, when the ladies were disposed to air, and the gentlemen with them, coaches and 6 came to hold them all. At an hour after 11, the bell rang to prayers, so at 6 in the evening, and through a gallery the best company went into an aisle in the church, so near was it, and the Duke and Duchess could see if all the family were there. The ordinary pastime of the ladies was in a gallery on the other side, where she had divers gentlewomen commonly at work upon embroidery and fringe-making, for all the beds of state were made and finished in the house. The meats were very neat and not gross. No servants in livery attended, but those called gentlemen only, and in the several kinds, even down to the small beer. Nothing could be more choice than the table was. It was an oblong and not an oval, and the Duchess with 2 daughters only sat at the upper end. If the gentleman chose a glass of wine, the civil offers were made either to go down into the vaults, which were very large and sumptuous, or servants at a sign given attended with salvers Roman 100, and brisk round went about. but no sitting at table with tobacco and healths, as the too common use is, and this way of entertaining continued a week, while we were there with incomparable variety, for the Duke had always some new project, building, walling, or planting, which he would show and ask his friends their advice about, and nothing was forced or strained, but easy and familiar as if it was, and really so. I thought it to be the common course and way of living in that family. One thing more I must needs relate, which the Duke told us smiling, and it was this: when he was in the midst of his building, his neighbour the Lord Chief Justice Hales made him a visit, and observing the many contrivances the Duke had for the disposing of so great a family, he craved leave to suggest one to him, which he thought would be much for his service, and it was to have but one door to his house, and the window of his study, where he sat most open upon. That this shows how hard it is for even wise and learned men to consider things without themselves. The children of the family were bred with a philosophical care. No inferior servants were permitted to entertain them, lest some mean sentiments or foolish notions and fables should steal into them, and nothing was so strongly impressed upon them as a sense of honor. Witness the Lord Arthur, who being about 5 years old, was very angry with the judge for hanging men. The judge told him that if they were not hanged, they would kill and steal. No, said the little boy, you should make them promise upon their honor they will not do so, and then they will not. It were well if this institutionary care of parents were always correspondent in the manners of all the children, for it is not often found to prove so. Life of the Lord Keeper Guilford, p. 132. Note Roman 27, brave Abdel o'er the prophet's school was placed. Abdel with all his father's virtue graced, p. 348. Christopher, Duke of Albemarle, son to the restorer of the monarchy, he seems to have had no particular character of his own, excepting that he was fond of mechanics, and suggested some improvements on the Devingbell. The Whig writers seldom mention him, without a sneer at his understanding. His talents were, however, sufficient to recommend him to be Chancellor of Cambridge in place of the Duke of Monmouth, once the idol of the university, but whose picture they in 1682 consigned to the flames. With all the solemnities of dishonor, there is a Pindaric ode upon the election of the Duke of Albemarle to this presidency over the seat of the Muses, containing a suitable quantity of bombast and flattery. It concludes by promising his grace a poetical immortality. Some happy favourite of the nine, some Spenser, Cowley, Dryden shall be thine. Happy bards who erst did dream near thy own Cam's inspiring stream. He midst the records of immortal fame, he midst the stars shall fix thy name. The Muses' safety and the Muses' theme. When Monmouth undertook his ill-fated expedition, Albemarle marched against him with the militia of Devon, but the ex-Chancellor of Cambridge baffled the attempts of his successor to coup him up at Lyme, and compelled him to retreat with some disorder. Monmouth, after assuming the title of king, sent a summons to Albemarle to claim his allegiance, who returned a cold and contemptuous answer. In 1687, Albemarle was sent abroad as governor of Jamaica, in which island he died. Note Roman 28, Eliab our next labor does invite, and hard the task to do Eliab right, p. 348. Sir Henry Bennet was the constant attendant of Charles Roman II during his exile after the Restoration. He became a member of the Cabal administration and Secretary of State. He was finally Lord Chamberlain, and through many turns of politics retained the favor of Charles Roman II, perhaps as much from making himself useful in his pleasures, as from the recollection of his faithful attachment. He was learned and accustomed to business, but being naturally of a slow understanding, and having acquired a formal manner during his stay in Spain, much enhanced by a black patch which he wore to conceal a wound on his nose, there was something ridiculously stiff in his demeanor. Charles Roman II, who put no value upon a friend in comparison to a jest, is said to have had much delight in seeing the Duke of Buckingham or any of his gay courtiers, by the help of a black patch and a white staff, enact. Harry Bennet Mulgrave thinks that a ludicrous idea being thus associated with Arlington and all that concerned him, he came to be generally thought a man of less abilities than he really was. He adds he was of a generous temper, and served his friends warmly. Being once ungratefully used by one whom he had benefited, he asked Mulgrave what effect he thought it would have upon him, and prevented his answer by saying it should neither cool his present friendship nor prevent him of the greatest happiness of his life, which was to serve the first deserving person that fell in his way. Although the Duke of York disliked Arlington, yet he suffered him to retain his situation at court. His religion may have saved him from disgrace, for Arlington was privately a Catholic, and avowed himself to be so on his deathbed. He died July 1685. Note Roman 29, and blessed again to see his flower allied to David's stock, and made young Othriel's bride. P. 349. Lady Isabella Bennet, only daughter and heiress of the Earl of Arlington, was married to Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, second son of Charles Roman II, by the Duchess of Cleveland. This match was against the inclination of the Duke's mother, for Derrick says he saw a letter from her to Danby dated at Paris in 1675, thanking him for endeavoring to prevent the match. The Duke of Grafton was bred to the sea after Monmouth had taken the popular courses, which we have reviewed. The king endeavored to set Grafton, though inferior in all personal accomplishments, in opposition to him. In the hearts of the people, he was appointed steward of the loyal apprentices' entertainment, and otherwise 397, placed in the public eye as the rival of Monmouth. He also was admitted to share his more profitable spoils, getting one of the regiments of the Guards formerly under Monmouth's command. When the Duke of Richmond was made master of the horse, Grafton was sent against Monmouth on his landing in the west, and attempted to beat up his rear with a body of horse. As he marched towards Frome, but was defeated, and very nearly made prisoner, the Duke of Grafton participated in the general discontent, which James II's measures excited through the kingdom, and remonstrated against them with professional frankness. The king ridiculed a seaman's pretensions to tenderness of conscience, and Grafton answered sturdily that if he had not much religion himself, he belonged to a party who had he was with the king when he headed his army to march against the Prince of Orange, and joined with Churchill in exhorting him to hazard a battle. We must hope that they meant to share the risque which they recommended, and that it was only a consciousness that the king had deserted his own cause which induced them to go over to the prince when their counsel was rejected. On the 28th September 1690, the Duke of Grafton was mortally wounded at the siege of Cork. As he commanded the squadron which covered the landing, he seems to have been a brave, rough, hard-tempered man, and would probably have made a figure as a naval officer. Note Roman 30, even envy must consent to Helen's worth, whose soul, though Egypt glories in his birth, could for our captive ark its zeal retain, and Pharaoh's altars in their pomp disdain. P. 349. Louis Duras, Earl of Feversham, brother of the French Marshals Duras and de Lorge, and nephew to the famous Marshal Turenne, he was born of a Huguenot family, and retained his religion, or the form of it, when both his brothers conformed to the Catholic Church. The Duke of York's opportune return from Flanders is said by Sir John Reresby to have been planned by this nobleman, who is therefore introduced here with singular propriety. He is said to have been brave, but appears from the only remarkable action in which he was ever engaged to have been a bad general and a cruel man. James Roman II, who had a high esteem for Feversham, placed him at the head of that body of disciplined troops which checked the career of Monmouth. He advanced to Bridgewater, of which Monmouth had got possession with some of the finest regiments in the service and 30 field pieces. The unfortunate adventurer seemed to have no refuge left, but to disperse his forces and fly for his safety, when the mode in which Feversham conducted himself gave him a fair chance for victory and a crown. He encamped in the open country 3 miles from the enemy, with only a dry ditch in his front, dispersed his cavalry in the neighboring hamlets, and retired quietly to bed, without either sending out reconnoitering parties or establishing advanced posts. It is no wonder that such a careless state he should have been completely surprised. It is only singular that, even allowing for the cowardice of Lord Grey, who fled instead of performing the safe and easy duty committed to him of firing the horse quarters of Feversham's army, he should have been able to recover the consequences of his negligence. Monmouth's men fought for 3 hours after they had been deserted by their cavalry. With the innate courage of English peasants, Feversham was still hard pressed, notwithstanding the gallant assistance afforded him by Dumbarton, when the Bishop of Bath and Wells decided the day, by causing the artillery to be turned upon the flank of Monmouth's followers. When they had given way, Feversham exhibited more of the cold-blooded cruelty of his country than he had done of their genius and fiery valor. While the battle lasted, the military bishop also proved himself a better lawyer than the general, as he had shewn himself in the fight a better soldier. But it was not till a warm expostulation was made on his part that the general ceased to execute the prisoners by martial law, and reserved them to a still more cruel fate from the forms of law as administered by the brutal Jeffreys. Neither Feversham's blunders nor his brutality seemed to lessen his merit in the eye of his sovereign. He received the Order of the Garter on the 31st July 1685, probably on the vacancy occasioned by the Duke of Monmouth's death, whose memory was on this occasion treated with signal ignominy. At the time of the Revolution, Lord Feversham was commander-in-chief, and proved himself incapable of taking any spirited steps for James's interest. For the army he commanded, though the officers were disaffected, would probably have fought had they been once fairly committed in opposition to the Dutch. When the king resolved to abandon everything and forsake his kingdom, he left behind a letter to Feversham stating that he should not expect his troops at present to expose themselves. The general might have secured a part of his forces by retreating along with the high-spirited Viscount of Dundee, who marched back into Scotland with the Scottish regiments. But Feversham was a man of another mould, and rather chose to augment the general confusion by disbanding the army when James was detected by the fishermen of Kent in his attempt to leave the kingdom. Feversham, with a party of his guards, was sent to conduct him back to his capital. James also chose him for the messenger when, yielding to sad necessity, he sent a letter to the Prince of Orange, inviting him to St. James, with a view doubtless to increase the terror of the king's mind and precipitate his intention of a second flight. The prince arrested the bearer of this humiliating embassy. This was the last public occasion on which James had occasion to employ the services of the unmilitary nephew of the great Turenne, whose name is connected with the most blameworthy and most melancholy passages of his reign. Note Roman 31. Our list of nobles. Next let Amri Grace, whose merits claim the Abethdon's high place, who with a loyalty that did excel, brought all the endowments of Achitophel p. 349. These lines, which sufficiently vouch their author to have been Tate, refer to Sir Heneage, a Finch, an eminent lawyer, who was first Attorney General, and upon Shaftesbury losing his seals succeeded him as Lord Keeper. He was a most incorruptible judge, and could not be swayed in his decisions even by the king's interference, which, upon all political occasions, was omnipotent with him. He was a good lawyer and a ready orator, but upon this last accomplishment he set, as all lawyers do, rather too high a value, for they whose profession necessarily leads them often to speak against their own opinion, and often to make much of trifles, are apt to lose in the ingenuity of their arguments the power of making a real impression upon the bosom of their hearers. North says that the business rather than the justice of the court flourished exceedingly under Finch, for he was a formalist, and took exceeding pleasure in encouraging and listening to nice distinctions of law, instead of taking a broad view of the equity of each case. He was a steady and active supporter of the Tory party on all occasions, in reward of which he was created Earl of Nottingham after a long and lingering disease, which terminated in a deep depression of spirits. This great lawyer died in 1682, and was succeeded by Lord Guildford as Lord Keeper. Note Roman 32. Than Sheva, none more loyal zeal have shown. Wakeful as Judah's lion, for the crown p. 350. Sir Roger L'Estrange was descended of a good family in Norfolk, and during the Civil War was in arms for the king. Being taken prisoner by the Parliament, he was condemned to die, but found means to obtain a pardon. He was a good performer on the violin, a quality which recommended him to Cromwell, under whose government he lived, if we may trust one of his antagonists, in ease and affluence, a circumstance with which he was afterwards as often reproached as our author with his panegyric on the Protector. The instant, however, that the restoration of monarchy approached, L'Estrange was among the first to hail it, and stepped forth to answer a pamphlet of Milton on the subject of a republic by a retort, which he irreverently entitled No Blind Guides after the Restoration. He was the great champion of the court, the High Church, and the Tory party. His principal vehicle of political instruction was the Observator, a paper published twice a week, but he also edited another called Heraclitus Ridens, and independently of both published answers, replies, rebutters, and surrebutters to every attack made upon him, besides quires of pamphlets on all popular subjects. For these good services he was knighted by King James. His style is in the last degree mean-crabbed and low, yet he possesses some power of argument and sarcasm. He appears to have first invented, or at least first practiced to a great extent, the foolish custom of printing emphatic passages in a different type from the rest of the page, and thereby too often affecting a point which the reader is unable to trace. For the other deeds of L'Estrange, and his numerous bedroll of fugitive pieces, the reader may consult the article in the Biographia. Note Roman 33. Calm were the elements, night's silence deep, the waves scarce murmuring, and the winds asleep. Yet fate for ruin takes so still an hour, and treacherous sands the princely bark devour. P. 351. The Duke of York, after a short visit to England, returned to Scotland by sea. The vessel unfortunately struck upon a bank called the Leman Ore, and the Duke, with a few attendants who crowded into the barge, were all who escaped from the wreck. Burnet says that the Duke showed no anxiety about the safety of anyone save his dogs and his priests, whom the bishop maliciously classes together. Others say he was principally interested about Churchill, who at the Revolution requited his anxiety, but indifferently. The Gazette says that, when the barge put off, the poor sailors who remained to perish manned the sides in the usual honorary form, and indifferent to their own fate, hailed the Duke's safety with 3 cheers, a circumstance alluded to a few lines below, where it is said the sufferers, with last loud breaths, their masters' scape applaud. In this shipwreck perished the Earl of Roxburgh, Mr. Hyde, a son of the great Clarendon, the Lord O'Brien, the Laird of Hoptown, Sir Joseph Douglas, Colonel Macnaghten, and about 300 seamen, besides the persons of the Duke's retinue. The verses which follow those concerning this lamentable accident describe the return of the Duke of York with his Duchess to England, a voyage which they performed without any sinister accident, and landed there upon the 27th May 1682. On this occasion they received many poetical greetings, both on the Duke's escape and their happy arrival, as for example Otway's prologue to the Duchess on her return from Scotland at the Duke's Theatre at Venice, preserved Roman 100, acted 31st May 1682. A Pindaric ode on their Royal Highnesses' return from Scotland after their escape at sea. To the Duke on his return 29th May 1682, written by Nathaniel Lee. A congratulatory poem to Her Royal Highness upon the arrival of their Royal Highnesses in England, May 27th, 1682. To His Royal Highness at his happy return from Scotland, written by a person of quality, 30th May 1682. Heaven, who declares in wonders so divine care of succession in the rightful line, that it protects you with a guardian hand from Whiggish lemons both of sea and land. Also a panegyric on their Royal Highnesses and congratulation on their return from Scotland. Note Roman 30. For this year did Xylo rule Jerusalem, and boldly all seditions, see it Stempe 353. Sir John Moore, the Tory Lord Mayor, an aged and respectable citizen of a mild character, and even hesitating and cautious in forming his measures, though sufficiently determined, when once satisfied of their propriety, which character, says North, was cut out for this time, and public occasion for nothing. But such firmness of mind and manifest goodness, with a seeming passive disposition, could have protected from those rages of violence as very often threatened him, and which probably had broke loose on anyone in his post that had carried matters with a stern and minatory behavior. He was proposed by the court party in the city for Lord Mayor, and being scarcely opposed by the other faction, easily carried his election. The Whigs were led into this blunder by mistaking the principles and underrating the resolution of the candidate, Sir John Moore, had been bred a nonconformist, and though he had taken the test with a view to civic honours, that was no more than had been done by Bethel Cornish, and others who retained in full vigour their sectarian principles. Besides, from the gentleness and softness of the new Lord Mayor's demeanour, his smooth and diffident way of talking in private, and his embarrassed elocution in public, they conceived that even if completely gained by the court, he would prove too passive and timorous to serve them essentially against active and energetic opponents. In both these particulars, they were woefully mistaken. Sir John proved to be most keenly disposed to second all the court measures, and he was kept up to the pitch of resolution necessary for carrying them through by the constant support, encouragement, and advice of the Duke of Ormond, whom the court employed to back him, and who during the contests which followed dined with the Lord Mayor 2 or 3 times every week. This election and its consequences was a severe blow to the fanatical interest in the city. The jovial custom of banquets and feasting was revived, and the musicians who had been long under restraint were restored to their privilege, which they employed in chaunting forth the praises of Sir John the Restorer. More of Morehall was not for a time more celebrated in song than the Lord Mayor his namesake, and a general revolution appeared to have taken place in the manners, as well as the principles of the citizens, which under the Whig government had savoured not a little of the ancient days of fanatical severity. Note Roman 35 Howe'er, encumbered with a viler pair than Ziph or Shimei to assist the chair. Yet Xilo's loyal labours so prevailed. That faction at the next election failed. P. 353. Ziph and Shimei were the Whig sheriffs in 1681, concerning whom see note upon Shimei in part. First, the viler pair were Thomas Pilkington and Samuel Shute, who followed out the practice of their predecessors in the mode of packing the juries on political trials, and had the honour to arrange that which acquitted the Earl of Shaftesbury. They were much hated by the court, and when they came with the recorder to invite the king to dine with the Lord Mayor, Charles forgot his usual politeness so far as to answer sternly, so agreeable was the city's invitation, that he would accept it, though brought by messengers so unwelcome to him. As these two sheriffs, Sir John Moore had a most violent contest with these two persons concerning the election of sheriffs for the ensuing year, about which the court were exceedingly anxious. It had been customary, when these elections were matters of little consequence, that the Lord Mayor designated a citizen to hold the office of sheriff by the ceremony of drinking to him, and sending him the cup. It was agreed by the court that this custom should be revived, as throwing the choice of one of the sheriffs into the hands of their partisan Sir John Moore. This being settled, the mayor in full form drank to Dudley North, brother of the Lord Keeper, Guilford, a Levant merchant, who accepted of that expensive office to please his brother, and to serve the court. The popular party determined to controvert this election, denying that a sheriff could be elected otherwise than by the livery, and proposed Papillon and Dubois, sturdy Whigs, for their candidates. The court, on the other hand, contending that North was duly and incontrovertibly elected by the jolly mode already mentioned, proposed a Mr. Box for the other sheriff, whose office only they allowed to be vacant. The common hall held on this occasion was as tumultuary as a raging tempest. At length the Lord Mayor, with the party who denied there were 2 vacancies, withdrew, while the country party remained, and polled for Papillon and Dubois under the direction of Shute and Pilkington. The last year's sheriffs, the court, affecting to consider this as a riot, interfered on that pretext, and a warrant was granted for committing the sheriffs to the Tower. Having found bail to answer for a misdemeanour, they returned to the charge with the same ardour as ever, and were actually about to complete their poll when the hall was adjourned by the orders of the Lord Mayor. The whole weight of the court was necessary to keep up the Lord Mayor's heart. At this crisis he was sent for to the Privy Council, encouraged, soothed, schooled, and finally assured by a writing under the Lord Keeper's hand that he might adjourn the Common Hall Roman 100, as he thought proper. Thus heartened, the Lord Mayor assumed to himself the whole management of the poll, although the sheriffs opened books for another, and denying the legality of any election, excepting his own declared box, duly returned. This citizen, however apprehensive of the consequences of acting under so dubious a nomination fined off, and declined to serve one rich, was found with more zeal and courage. And during the tumult of a common hall, which resounded with the cries of no election Roman 100, this gentleman was elected sheriff by a few of the Lord Mayor's partisans, and declared duly returned by the Lord Mayor, who immediately proceeded to dissolve the common hall. North and Rich were accordingly sworn in as sheriffs for the year, but a guard of the train bands was necessary to protect them, while they thus qualified themselves for entering on their office. This contest was followed by another for the office of Lord Mayor Good. The popular candidate was returned by a considerable majority, but upon a scrutiny, the court party, by dint of real or pretended disqualifications, gained such an advantage that Pritchard, their candidate, was returned by a majority of 14 voices. The importance of these elections was soon visible. The popular party were utterly disheartened, and their leaders exposed to the same practices from packing juries, which they had themselves employed. The court used their victory remorselessly. Pilkington, the ex-sheriff, was found liable in 100,000 damages for having said that the Duke of York had fired the city and was now come to cut all their throats. Those concerned in carrying on the double pole were severely fined as guilty of a riot. Sir Patience Ward, an alderman of the popular party, was declared obnoxious to a charge of perjury for an inconsistence in his evidence on Pilkington's trial. In short, the royal vengeance was felt by all who had been active in opposition to the court. But the extent of the court's victory was best evinced by the conduct of Shaftesbury, who, seeing his stronghold, the magistracy of the city, thus invaded and occupied by his enemies, fled from his house in Aldersgate Street, and for some time lay concealed in Wapping, trusting for his safety to the very lowest of mankind. From this hiding place he sent forth messages to the other heads of the party, in which he urged the most desperate measures, but finding it impossible to combine the various persons concerned in one plan of enterprise, and sensible of the danger of discovery, which each day's delay rendered more imminent, after a bitter contest between fear and rage, he fled to Amsterdam. His retreat was followed by the trial of the conspirators in the Rye House plot, and doubtless the court on that occasion knew well how to avail themselves of the power of selecting juries so long possessed by their enemies, and now in their own hands. During the short remainder of this reign, the king's authority was paramount and supreme. His enemies were at his feet, and not a whisper of opposition disturbed his reposia. Deceitful and delusive calm, which his unfortunate successor soon saw changed into a tempest. The medal, a satire against sedition, per Graham Populos Medic, per Elides Urbum, ibet ovens divumc sibi possibet honors. The medal. The medal was published in the beginning of March 1682, about 4 months after the appearance of the first part of Absalom and Achitophel, and 8 months before the publication of the second part of that poem. The circumstances which led to it require us to notice Shaftesbury's imprisonment and acquittal. On the 2 July 1681, the Earl of Shaftesbury was apprehended by virtue of a warrant from council, and after his papers had been seized, and he himself had undergone an examination, was committed to the Tower. Upon the 24th November 1681, a bill for high treason was presented against him to the grand jury of Middlesex. When the witnesses were adduced, the jurors demanded that they might be examined in private, and Pilkington, the Whig sheriff, required that they should be examined separately. Both requests were refused by the court. One Booth was then examined, who swore that Lord Shaftesbury had told him he intended to carry down to the Oxford Parliament a party of 50 gentlemen and their servants, armed and mounted, to be commanded by a Captain Wilkinson, and that his lordship stated this force to be provided for the purpose of repelling any attack which the king's guards might make on the Parliament, and, if necessary, to take the king from his bad advisers by force and bring him to the city of London. The witness said he was invited by Wilkinson to be one of this band, and provided himself with a good horse and arms for the service, which was prevented by the sudden dissolution of the Oxford Parliament. 7 other witnesses, Smith, Turberville, Haynes, and 3 persons called McNamara, swore that Shaftesbury had used to them, and each of them individually, the most treasonable expressions concerning the king's person, had declared he had no more title to the crown than the Duke of Buckingham, that he deserved to be deposed, and that he, Shaftesbury, would dethrone him and convert the kingdom into a commonwealth. Here was enough of swearing at least to make a true bill, but the character of the witnesses was infamous. Booth was a swindler, and could never give an account of the stable in which he kept his pretended charger, or produce anyone who had seen it. Smith, by his own confession, had changed his religion twice, was one of the evidences of the popish plot, and intimate with the villain Oates. Turberville stood in the same predicament of an infamous fellow, and an evidence for the plot. He is said to have apologized for his apostasy by saying plainly that the Protestant citizens had forsaken him, and God damn him, he would not starve. The other witnesses were Irishmen, and there was something remarkable in their history. They had pretended to discover a Catholic plot in Ireland, which, if one had existed anywhere, was doubtless the place where it might have been found. Their evidence, however, contained pretty much such a rawhead and bloody-bones story as that of Oates, and equally unworthy of credit. Yet Shaftesbury constituted himself their protector, and had them brought over to England, where he doubtless intended that their Irish plot should be as warmly agitated in the Oxford Parliament as the English conspiracy. In that of 1679, Macnamara's narrative of the conspiracy is dedicated to his lordship, because it was not only known to the dedicator, but to the whole Christian world how conspicuous his lordship had been for his indefatigable zeal and vigilance over the safety of his Majesty's most sacred person, and the welfare of the whole extent of his dominions. The sudden dissolution of the Oxford Parliament, which had such important consequences in various respects, prevented the prosecution of the Irish plot. Besides, it seems to have escaped even Shaftesbury that popular terror, the most powerful of engines, loses its excitability by too frequent alarms. The theme of a plot began to be listened to with indifference. That of Ireland fell to the ground without exciting clamor or terror, but the witnesses remained. There is a story of some Irish recruits who, being detected in a brawl, justified themselves by saying they were paid by the king for fighting, and it was quite the same to them where they fought, or with whom. The witnesses were equally sedulous in their vocation, and equally indifferent about the application of their labors. For finding the court had obtained an ascendancy, they readily turned with the tide and bore evidence, as we have seen, against their original protector and encourager. The Tories basely availed themselves of the readiness with which this hungry pack of bloodhounds turned against their huntsmen, and triumphantly claimed for them the same credit which the Whigs had demanded in former cases, although they must have been conscious that they were employing the worst arts, as well as the most infamous implements of their enemies. Besides the infamy of these men's character, their story was very improbable, as it could hardly be supposed that Shaftesbury, the veteran leader of a party, should have committed himself so deeply in unnecessary and unreserved communication with these vulgar banditti, or expressed himself against the king in such low and gross language as they imputed to him. Such being the oral testimony, and such its defects, the Crown lawyers endeavored to aid it by founding upon certain papers found in Shaftesbury's study. One of these contained the names of the principal persons in the nation, divided into two lists, one titled Worthy Men, and the other Men Worthy, which last contained the principal Tories, and the legend was understood to mean men worthy to be hanged. This was too enigmatical to bear much argument, but there was also found a draft of an association against popery, in which many dangerous topics were stated. It was thereby declared that the Papist plot was still advancing, and that the Catholics had been highly encouraged by James, Duke of York, that mercenary forces had been levied and kept on foot contrary to law and to the danger of the king's person. Therefore the persons associating were to bind themselves to defend first the Protestant religion, and then the king's person and liberties of the subject against all encroachment and usurpation of arbitrary power, and to endeavor to disband all such mercenary forces as were kept up in and about the city of London, to the great amazement and terror of all the good people of the land. Also never to consent that the Duke of York or any professed papist should succeed to the crown, but by all lawful means, and by force of arms, if necessary, to resist and oppose his so doing by a still more formidable clause, it was provided that the subscribers were to receive orders from the Parliament if sitting, but if it should be dissolved from the majority of the association itself. Lastly, that no one should separate from the rest of the association, on pain of being by the others prosecuted and suppressed, as a perjured person and public enemy. Much dangerous, and even treasonable inference may be drawn from this model, but it was only an unsigned scroll, and did not appear to have been framed or even revised and approved of by Shaftesbury. With such evidence against him, Shaftesbury might have gone safely before a jury of indifferent men could such have been found, but the Whig sheriffs Shute and Pilkington left nothing to hazard, and took good care the assize should consist of men picked out of the very centre of their own party. We recognize the names of Godfrey, brother to Sir Edmund Berry of Papillon, and Dubois, the Whig candidates for the shrievalty against North, and Rich, of Sir Samuel Barnardiston, who maintained a furious action against the High Sheriff of Suffolk, for a double return of Shepherd the wine merchant, at whose house the Duke of Monmouth, Lord Russell Roman 100 afterwards held their meetings of Edwin the Presbyterian, and others less noted in history, but not less remarkable at the time for the violence of their partisal. After a short consideration, they returned the bill ignoramus, upon which there was a shout of continued applause in the court, which lasted for an hour, and the city in the evening blazed with bonfires to celebrate the escape of their Protestant leader. Such was the history of this noted trial, which took place at a time when the course of law had lost its deep still channel, and all causes were carried by a fierce impetuous torrent, which threatened to break down the banks, and become a general inundation. Accustomed to a pure administration of justice, we now look back with disgust and horror upon times when, to bring in a just verdict, it was necessary to assemble a packed jury. The triumph of the Whigs was unbounded, and among other symptoms of exultation, it displayed itself in that which gave rise to this poem of Dryden. This was a medal of Lord Shaftesbury, struck by William Bower, an artist, who had executed some popular pieces allusive to the Roman Catholic plot. The obverse presented the bust of the Earl, with the legend Antonio Comiti de Shaftesbury. The reverse, a view of London, the bridge, and the tower. The sun is rising above the tower, and just in the act of dispersing a cloud. The legend around the exurg is El Tamer, and beneath is the date of his acquittal, 24th November 1681. The partisans of the acquitted patriot wore these medals at their breasts, and care was taken that this emblem should be made as general as possible. The success of Absalom and Achitophel made the Tories look to our author as the only poet whose satire might check or ridicule the popular triumph of Shaftesbury. If the following anecdote, which Spence has given on the authority of a Catholic priest, a friend of Pope, be absolutely correct, Charles himself engaged Dryden to write on this theme one day. As the king was walking in the Mall and talking with Dryden, he said, "If I was a poet, and I think I am poor enough to be one, I would write a poem on such a subject in the following manner." He then gave him the plan of the medal. Dryden took the hint, carried the poem as soon as it was written to the king, and had a present of 100 broad pieces for it. The merits of the medal as a satirical poem are universally acknowledged, nor does it greatly suffer from being placed, as the subject naturally invites in comparison with Absalom and Achitophel. The latter, as a group of figures, presents greater scope and variety, and may be therefore more generally interesting than the portrait of an individual, but it does not more fully display the abilities of the artist. Nothing can be more forcibly described than the whole of Shaftesbury's political career, and, to use the nervous language of Johnson, the picture of a man whose propensions to mischief are such that his best actions are but inability of wickedness, is very skillfully delineated and strongly colored the comparison of his best and most politic counsels to the cures effected by those called white witches, whom it was unlawful to consult, because even in accomplishing innocent purposes they used infernal arts. Is poignantly severe the succeeding lines in which the poet ridicules bitterly that appeal to the people, which the demagogues of that as of all periods were desirous to represent as the criterion of truth, contains the essence of all that 100 philosophers can say upon the topic. His stern and indignant picture of the citizens of London, unjust as it is if meant to express their general character, is in individual instances too often verified. That looseness which habitual chicane in trade introduces into mercantile morality, that bustling activity, which however meritorious when within its sphere, is so apt to extend itself, where its exertion is only mischievous and absurd, and that natural turn to democracy which arises from frequenting popular meetings and from ambition of civic honors, that half acquaintance with the affairs of other countries and half intimacy with the laws of our own, acquired in the course of mercantile transactions all combine, but too often to turn an useful sober citizen into a meddling pragmatical opinionative politician. The strong and gloomy picture of the fanatics, which succeeds, describes a race of men, now, in a great measure, extinct, of whom the influence, though declining even in the poet's time, continued to be powerful, and which had in the preceding generation prostrated before them both the mitre and the throne. The comparison of the fanatical ideas of religion entertained by these dissenting teachers with the supposed principles of the libertine and latitudinarian Shaftesbury gave scope for some nervous satire, and led the author naturally to consider the probable result of the schemes of these incongruous allies. These he predicts, according to the progress of things after the great Civil War, to be successively the dominion of presbytery and depression of the gentry, the insurrection of the independents and other sects against their spiritual tyranny, quarrels between the civil and military leaders, the commons destroying the peerage, a democratical republic, a military tyranny, and by the blessing of heaven, a restoration of the rightful, ere all these scenes had already passed at no distant period. And now, while the sword was yet in the sheath, though the hand was upon its hilt, the masterly and energetic language in which they are detailed may have tempted many to pause and think whether the evils of which they complained deserved the risque of so desperate a remedy. Such is the plan of this admirable poem. The language is as striking as the ideas, and subject the illustrations and images are short and apposite, such as give force to the argument and flow easily into the diction, without appearing to have been labored or brought from a distance. I fear, however, some of the scriptural allusions are censurable as too free, if not profane. The verse has all the commanding emphasis with which Dryden beyond any other poet knew how to body forth and adorn his poetical arguments. One Alexandrine is prolonged 2 syllables beyond the usual length, a circumstance hardly worth notice, were it not to show the sharp-sighted malice of Dryden's enemies, who could discover this single inaccuracy, if indeed the license was not intentional, amid so much sounding versification. As the medal attracted immediate and extensive attention, the Whig champions stepped forth to the contest. The Mushroom by Edmund Hickeringel first appeared, and in succession the medal reversed by Samuel Pordage, which procured its author a couplet in the second part of Absalom, and Achitophel the loyal medal vindicated, and the medal of John Bayes, all of which, and perhaps many more, appeared in the summer and autumn of 1681. 2 satires of a more general nature, entitled Dryden's Satire to his Muse, and the Tory poets, were also published against our author in the course of that year, a sufficient proof of the irritation of that party whose chief he had now twice held up to public detestation. The popularity of the medal did not cease with the crisis which gave it birth. It went through many editions, and only became less known when successive changes had totally worn away all remembrance of the intrigues of the eminent politician against whom it was directed. Johnson has said it is now not much read nor perhaps generally understood, yet a slight acquaintance with the history of the period removes all obscurity, and though we cannot sympathize with the fervor of politics which it contains, the poetry has claims to popularity widely independent of the temporary nature of the subject. As the reader is now to take a long farewell of Lord Shaftesbury, it may not be unnecessary to remind him that when freed from the accusation of high treason, the Earl continued to agitate plans of opposition to the government, which became more and more violent as the ascendancy of the court became more powerful, until open force seemed to be the only means left of accomplishing what undoubtedly he had at first hoped to carry through by political intrigue. At length, he found it necessary to fly from his house in Aldersgate Street and take refuge in the suburbs of the city, from whence he sent messages to his associates urging them to take arms. But he was now doomed to experience what his ardent temper had before prevented him from considering when they came to the crisis. The different views and dispositions of the allies began to discover themselves. Russell, limited his wishes to security for liberty. Monmouth stipulated his own succession on Charles' death. Sidney demanded a free commonwealth, and all dreaded Shaftesbury, who they were sensible was determined to be at the head of the kind of government adopted, whatever that might be, nor were their tempers less discordant than their plans, while an inferior order of conspirators were organizing plans for assassinating the whole royal family. Monmouth was anxious for the life of his father Russell, averse to shedding the blood of his countrymen Grey Howard and Trenchard from meaner motives, unwilling to encounter the dangers of war after a desperate threat to commence the rising, and make the honor and danger all his own. Shaftesbury at length fled to Holland, where he landed. In November 1682, the magistrates of Amsterdam gave him welcome and enrolled him among their citizens to evade any claim by the Court of England on his person. Yet they failed not to remind him of his former declaration of delenda est Carthago, accompanying the freedom which they presented to him with these words: ob nostra Carthagin nondum deleta salutum, accipe here, while pondering the consequences of former intrigues, and perhaps adjusting new machinations. Shaftesbury was seized with the gout in his stomach, and expired on the 21st January 16,823. To sift the character of this extraordinary man, and divide his virtues from his vices, his follies from his talents, would be a difficult, perhaps an impossible task. Charles is said to have borne testimony that he had more law than all his judges and more divinity than all his bishops, but his shining qualities were sullied by that inordinate ambition, which brought its own punishment in an unworthy flight, an untimely, at least a precipitated death, and a dubious reputation. Sleep thou most active of mankind, O make thy last low bed, and death's long requiem take. Thou who whilst living keptst the world awake. Epistle to the Whigs. For to whom can I dedicate this poem with so much justice as to you? 'Tis the representation of your own hero, 'tis the picture drawn at length, which you admire and prize so much in little. None of your ornaments are wanting, neither the landscape of your tower, nor the rising sun, nor the anno domini of your new sovereign's coronation. This must needs be grateful undertaking to your whole party, especially to those who have not been so happy as to purchase the original. I hear the graver has made a good market of it. All his kings are bought up already, or the value of the remainder so enhanced that many a poor Pollander, who would be glad to worship the image, is not able to go to the cost of him, but must be content to see him here. I must confess I am no great artist, but signpost painting will serve the turn to remember a friend by, especially when better is not to be had. Yet for your comfort the lineaments are true, and though he sat not 5 times to me, as he did to be, yet I have consulted history, as the Italian painters do when they would draw a Nero or a Caligula. Though they have not seen the man, they can help their imagination by a statue of him, and find out the coloring from Suetonius and Tacitus. Truth is, you might have spared one side of your medal. The head would be seen to more advantage if it were placed on a spike of the tower, a little nearer to the sun, which would then break out to better purpose. You tell us in your preface to the not Protestant plot that you shall be forced hereafter to leave off your modesty. I suppose you mean that little which is left you, for it was worn to rags when you put out this medal. Never was there practiced such a piece of notorious impudence in the face of an established government. I believe when he is dead you will wear him in thumbrings, as the Turks did Skanderbeg, as if there were virtue in his bones to preserve you against monarchy. Yet all this, while you pretend not only zeal for the public good, but a due veneration for the person of the king. But all men who can see an inch before them may easily detect those gross fallacies, that it is necessary for men in your circumstances to pretend both is granted you, for without them there could be no ground to raise a faction. But I would ask you one civil question: what right has any man among you, or any association of men, to come nearer to you who out of Parliament cannot be considered in a public capacity, to meet as you daily do in factious clubs, to vilify the government in your discourses, and to libel it in all your writings? Who made you judges in Israel? Or how is it consistent with your zeal for the public welfare to promote sedition? Does your definition of loyal, which is to serve the king according to the laws, allow you the license of traducing the executive power, with which you own, he is invested, you complain that his majesty has lost the love and confidence of his people, and by your very urging it, you endeavor what in you lies to make him lose them. All good subjects abhor the thought of arbitrary power, whether it be in one or many. If you were the patriots you would seem, you would not at this rate incense the multitude to assume it, for no sober man can fear it either from the king's disposition or his practice, or even where you would odiously lay it from his ministers. Give us leave to enjoy the government and benefit of laws under which we were born, and which we desire to transmit to our posterity. You are not the trustees of the public liberty, and if you have not right to petition in a crowd, much less have you to intermeddle in the management of affairs, or to arraign what you do not like, which in effect is everything that is done by the king and council. Can you imagine that any reasonable man will believe you respect the person of his majesty, when it is apparent that your seditious pamphlets are stuffed with particular reflections on him? If you have the confidence to deny this, it is easy to be evinced from 1,000 passages, which I only forbear to quote, because I desire they should die and be forgotten. I have perused many of your papers, and to show you that I have the third part of your not Protestant plot, is much of it stolen from your dead author's pamphlet, called The Growth of Popery, as manifestly as Milton's Defense of the English People is from Buchanan de Jure Regni apud Scotos, or your First Covenant and New Association from the Holy League of the French Guisards. Anyone who reads Davila may trace your practices all along there, with the same pretenses for reformation and loyalty, the same aspersions of the king, and the same grounds of a rebellion. I know not whether you will take the historian's word, who says it was reported that Poltrot, a Huguenot, murdered Francis, Duke of Guise, by the instigations of Theodore Beza, or that it was a Huguenot minister, otherwise called a Presbyterian for our church, abhors so devilish a tenet, who first writ a treatise of the lawfulness of deposing and murdering kings of a different persuasion in religion. But I am able to prove from the doctrine of Calvin and principles of Buchanan that they set the people above the magistrate, which, if I mistake not, is your own fundamental, and which carries your loyalty no farther than your liking, when a vote of the House of Commons goes on your side. You are as ready to observe it as if it were passed into a law, but when you are pinched with any former and yet unrepealed Act of Parliament, you declare that in some cases you will not be obliged by it. The passage is in the same third part of the not Protestant plot, and is too plain to be denied. The late copy of your intended association you neither wholly justify nor condemn, but as the papists, when they are unopposed, fly out into all the pageantries of worship, but in times of war, when they are hard-pressed by arguments, lie close, entrenched behind the Council of Trent. So now, when your affairs are in a low condition, you dare not pretend that to be a legal combination, but whensoever you are afloat, I doubt not, but it will be maintained and justified to purpose, for indeed there is nothing to defend it, but the sword. It is the proper time to say anything when men have all things in their power. In the meantime, you would fain be nibbling at a parallel betwixt this association and that in the time of Queen Elizabeth, but there is this small difference betwixt them, that the ends of the one are directly opposite to the other, one with the Queen's approbation and conjunction as head of it, the other without either the consent or knowledge of the king, against whose authority it is manifestly designed. Therefore you do well to have recourse to your last evasion, that it was contrived by your enemies, and shuffled into the papers that were seized, which yet you see the nation is not so easy to believe as your own jury. But the matter is not difficult to find 12 men in Newgate who would acquit a malefactor. I have only one favor to desire of you at parting, that, when you think of answering this poem, you would employ the same pens against it who have combated with so much success against Absalom and Achitophel, for then you may assure yourselves of a clear victory without the least reply. Rail at me abundantly, and not to break a custom do it without wit. By this method you will gain a considerable point, which is wholly to waive the answer of my arguments. Never own the bottom of your principles, for fear they should be treason. Fall severely on the miscarriages of government, for if scandal be not allowed, you are no freeborn subjects. If God has not blessed you with the talent of rhyming, make use of my poor stock, and welcome, let your verses run upon my feet. And for the utmost refuge of notorious blockheads, reduced to the last extremity of sense, turn my own lines upon me, and in utter despair of your satire, make me satirize myself. Some of you have been driven to this bay already, but above all the rest, commend me to the nonconformist parson who writ the whip, and key, I am afraid, it is not read so much as the piece deserves, because the bookseller is every week crying help at the end of his gazette. To get it off, you see, I am charitable enough to do him a kindness, that it may be published as well as printed, and that so much skill in Hebrew derivations may not lie for waste paper in the shop. Yet I half suspect he went no farther for his learning than the index of Hebrew names and etymologies, which is printed at the end of some English Bibles. If a chitophel signify the brother of a fool, the author of that poem will pass with his readers for the next of kin. And perhaps it is the relation that makes the kindness, whatever the verses are, by them up, I beseech you out of pity, for I hear the conventicle is shut up, and the brother of a chitophel out of service. Now footmen, you know, have the generosity to make a purse for a member of their society who has had his livery pulled over his ears, and even Protestant socks are bought up among you out of veneration to the name. A dissenter in poetry from sense and English will make as good a Protestant rhymer as a dissenter from the Church of England. Protestant parson, besides, if you encourage a young beginner who knows, but he may elevate his style a little above the vulgar epithets of profane and saucy Jack, an atheistic scribbler, with which he treats me when the fit of enthusiasm is strong upon him, by which well-mannered and charitable expressions I was certain of his sect before I knew his name. What would you have more of a man? He has damned me in your cause from Genesis to the Revelations, and has half the texts of both the testaments against me, if you will be so civil to yourselves as to take him for your interpreter, and not to take them for Irish witnesses. After all, perhaps you will tell me that you retained him only for the opening of your cause, and that your main lawyer is yet behind now. If it so happen he meet with no more reply than his predecessors, you may either conclude that I trust to the goodness of my cause, or fear my adversary, or disdain him, or what you please. For the short of it is indifferent to your humble servant, whatever your party says or thinks of him. Recommendatory verses. Upon the author of the following poem, once more our awful poet arms to engage the threatening hydrofaction of the age, once more prepares his dreadful pen to wield, and every muse attends him to the field, by art and nature for this task designed. Yet modestly the fight he long declined, forbore the torrent of his verse to pour, nor loosed his satire till the needful hour. His sovereign's right by patience half betrayed, waked his avenging genius to its aid. Blessed muse, whose wit with such a cause was crowned, and blessed the cause that such a champion found. With chosen verse upon the foe he falls, and black sedition in each quarter galls. Yet like a prince with subjects forced to engage, secure of conquest, he rebates his rage. His fury not without distinction sheds, hurls mortal bolts but on devoted heads, to less infected members gentle found, or spares or else pours balm into the wound. Such generous grace the ungrateful tribe abuse, and trespass on the mercy of his muse. Their wretched doggerel rhymers forth they bring, to snarl and bark against the poet's king, a crew that scandalized the nation more than all their treason-counting priests before. On these he scarce vouchsafes a scornful smile, but on their powerful patrons turns his style, a style so keen as even from faction draws. The vital poison stabs to the heart their cause. Take then, great bard, what tribute we can raise. Accept our thanks, for you transcend our praise. To the unknown author of the following poem, and that of Absalom and Achitophel, thus pious ignorance with dubious praise, altars of old to gods unknown did raise. They knew not the loved deity they knew. Divine effects a cause divine did show. Nor can we doubt when such these numbers are. Such is their cause, though the worst muse shall dare their sacred worth in humble verse declare. As gentle Thames, charmed with thy tuneful song, glides in a peaceful majesty along, no rebel stone, no lofty bank does brave the easy passage of his silent wave. So sacred poet, so thy numbers flow, sinewy yet mild as happy lovers woo, strong yet harmonious too as planets move, yet soft as down upon the wings of love. How sweet does virtue in your dress appear, how much more charming when much less severe, whilst you our senses harmlessly beguile with all the allurements of your happy style. You insinuate loyalty with kind deceit, and into sense the unthinking many cheat. So the sweet Thracian with his charming lyre into rude nature virtue did inspire. So he the savage herd to reason drew, yet scarce so sweet, so charmingly as you. Oh, that you would with some such powerful charm enervate Albion to just valor warm, whether much suffering Charles shall theme afford, or the great deeds of godlike James sword. Again fair Gallia might be ours again, another fleet might pass the subject main, another Edward lead the Britons on, or such an ossuary as you did moan, while in such numbers you, in such a strain, inflame their courage and reward their pain. Let false Achitophel the rout engage, talk easy Absalom to rebel rage. Let frugal Shimei curse in holy zeal, or modest Korah more new plots reveal, whilst constant to himself, secure of fate, good David still maintains the royal state, though each in vain such various ills employs. Firmly he stands, and even those ills enjoys. Firm as fair Albion midst the raging main, surveys encircling danger with disdain. In vain the waves assault the unmoved shore, in vain the winds with mingled fury roar. Fair Albion's beauteous cliffs shine whiter than before, nor shalt thou move though hell thy fall conspire, though the worse rage of zeal's fanatic fire. Thou best, thou greatest of the British race, thou only fit to fill great Charles his place. Our wretched Britons are too stubborn isle, our stiff-necked Israel on blessed Canaan's soil, are those dear proofs of heaven's indulgence vain, restoring David and his gentle reign. Is it in vain thou all the goods dost know, auspicious stars on mortals shed below, while all thy streams with milk, thy lands with honey flow? No more fond isle, no more thyself engaged in civil fury and intestine rage. No rebel zeal thy duteous land molest, but a smooth calm sooth every peaceful breast, while in such charming notes divinely sings the best of poets of the best of kings. To face page 430 vol 9th. The medal of all our antic sights and pageantry, which English idiots run in crowds to see. The Polish medal bears the prize alone, a monster more the favorite of the town than either fairs or theatres have shown. Never did art so well with nature strive, nor ever idol seemed so much alive. So like the man, so golden to the sight, so base within, so counterfeit and light. One side is filled with title and with face, and lest the king should want a regal place. On the reverse, a tower the town surveys, o'er which our mounting sun his beams displays. The word pronounced aloud by shrivel voice, El Tama, which in Polish is rejoice. The day, month, year to the great act are joined, and a new canting holiday designed. 5 days he sat for every cast and look, 4 more than God to finish Adam took. But who can tell what essence angels are, or how long heaven was making Lucifer? Oh, could the style that copied every grace, and ploughed such furrows for an eunuch face could it have formed his ever-changing will. The various piece had tired the graver's skill. A martial hero first with early care, blown like a pygmy by the winds to war. A beardless chief, a rebel ere a man. So young his hatred to his prince began. Next Thisho wildly will ambition steer, a vermin wriggling in the usurper's ear. Bartering his venal wit for sums of gold, he cast himself into the saint-like mold, groaned, sighed, and prayed while godliness was gain, the loudest bagpipe of the squeaking train. But as 'tis hard to cheat a juggler's eyes, his open lewdness he could ne'er disguise. There split the saint for hypocritic zeal, allows no sins but those it can conceal. Whoring to scandal gives too large a scope. Saints must not trade, but they may interlope. The ungodly principle was all the same, but a gross cheat betrays his partner's game. Besides, their pace was formal, grave, and slack. His nimble wit outran the heavy pack. Yet still he found his fortune at a stay. Whole droves of blockheads choking up his way. They took, but not rewarded, his advice. Villain and wit exact a double price. Power was his aim, but thrown from that pretense. The wretch turned loyal in his own defense, and malice reconciled him to his prince. Him in the anguish of his soul he served, rewarded faster still than he deserved. Behold him now exalted into trust. His counsels oft convenient, seldom just. Even in the most sincere advice he gave, he had a grudging still to be a knave. The frauds he learned in his fanatic years made him uneasy in his lawful gears. At best as little honest as he could, and like white witches mischievously good. To his first bias longingly he leans, and rather would be great by wicked means. Thus framed for ill, he loosed our triple hold. Advice unsafe, precipitous, and bold. From hence those tears, that Ilium of our woe. Who helps a powerful friend, forearms a foe? What wonder if the waves prevail so far, when he cut down the banks that made the bar? Seas follow, but their nature to invade. But he by art our native strength betrayed. So Samson to his foe his force confessed, and to be shorn lay slumbering on her breast. But when this fatal counsel, found too late, exposed its author to the public hate, when his just sovereign by no impious way could be seduced to arbitrary sway, forsaken of that hope, he shifts his sail, drives down the current with a popular gale, and shows the fiend confessed without a veil. He preaches to the crowd that power is lent, but not conveyed to kingly governments. That claims successive bear no binding force. That coronation oaths are things of course. Maintains the multitude can never err, and sets the people in the papal chair. The reason's obvious interest never lies. The most have still their interest in their eyes. The power is always theirs, and power is ever wise. Almighty crowd, thou shortenest all dispute. Power is thy essence, wit thy attribute. Nor faith nor reason make thee at a stay. Thou leapst o'er all eternal truths in thy Pindaric way. Athens no doubt did righteously decide, when Phocion and when Socrates were tried. As righteously they did those dooms repent. Still they were wise, whatever way they went. Crowds err not, though to both extremes they run, to kill the father and recal the son. Some think the fools were most, as times went then, but now the world's o'erstocked with prudent men. The common cry is even religion's test. The Turks is at Constantinople best, idols in India, popery at Rome, and our own worship only true at home. And true, but for the time 'tis hard to know. How long we please it shall continue so. This side today, and that tomorrow burns. So all are God-almighties in their turns, attempting doctrine, plausible and new. What fools our fathers were if this be true, who to destroy the seeds of civil war, inherent right in monarchs did declare, and that a lawful power might never cease, secured succession to secure our peace. Thus property and sovereign sway at last, in equal balances were justly cast. But this new Jehu spurs the hot-mouthed horse, instructs the beast to know his native force, to take the bit between his teeth and fly to the next headlong steep of anarchy. Too happy England, if our good we knew, would we possess the freedom we pursue. The lavish government can give no more, yet we repine, and plenty makes us poor. God tried us once, our rebel fathers fought. He glutted them with all the power they sought, till mastered by their own usurping brave, the freeborn subject sunk into a slave. We loathe our manna, and we long for quails. Ah, what is man when his own wish prevails? How rash, how swift to plunge himself in ill, proud of his power and boundless in his will. That kings can do no wrong, we must believe. None can they do, and must they all receive. Help heaven or sadly, we shall see an hour when neither wrong nor right are in their power. Already they have lost their best defense, the benefit of laws which they dispense. No justice to their righteous cause allowed, but baffled by an arbitrary crowd, and medals graved their conquest to record, the stamp and coin of their adopted lord. The man who laughed but wants to see an ass, mumbling to make the cross-grained thistles pass, might laugh again to see a jury chew the prickles of unpalatable law. The witnesses that leech-like lived on blood, sucking for them were medicinally good. But when they fastened on their festered sore, then justice and religion they forswore. Their maiden oaths debauched into a whore. Thus men are raised by factions and decried, and rogue and saint distinguished by their side. They rack even scripture to confess their cause, and plead a call to preach in spite of laws. But that's no news to the poor injured page. It has been used as ill in every age, and is constrained with patience all to take. For what defense can Greek and Hebrew make? Happy who can this talking trumpet seize. They make it speak whatever sense they please. 'Twas framed at first our oracle to inquire, but since our sects in prophecy grow higher, the text inspires not them, but they the text inspire. London, thou great emporium of our isles, O thou too bounteous, thou too fruitful Nile, how shall I praise or curse to thy desert, or separate thy sound from thy corrupted part? I called thee Nile, the parallel will stand. Thy tides of wealth o'erflow the fattened land. Yet monsters from thy large increase we find, engendered on the slime thou leav'st behind. Sedition has not wholly seized on thee. Thy nobler parts are from infection free. Of Israel's tribes thou hast a numerous band, but still the Canaanite is in the land. Thy military chiefs are brave and true, nor are thy disenchanted burghers few. The head is loyal which thy heart commands, but what's a head with two such gouty hands? The wise and wealthy love the surest way, and are content to thrive and to obey. But wisdom is to sloth too great a slave. None are so busy as the fool and knave. Those let me curse, what vengeance will they earn, whose ordures neither plague nor fire can purge, nor sharp experience can to duty bring, nor angry heaven, nor a forgiving king. In gospel phrase, their chapmen they betray. Their shops are dens, the buyer is their prey. The knack of trades is living on the spoil. They boast even when each other they beguile. Customs to steal is such a trivial thing, that tease their charter to defraud their king. All hands unite of every jarring sect. They cheat the country first and then infect. They for God's cause their monarchs dare dethrone, and they'll be sure to make his cause their own. Whether the plotting Jesuit laid the plan of murdering kings or the French Puritan, our sacrilegious sects their guides outgo, and kings and kingly power would murder too. What means their traitorous combination less? Too plain to evade, too shameful to confess. But treason is not owned when 'tis descried. Successful crimes alone are justified. The men who know conspiracy would find, who doubts but had it taken they had joined in a mutual covenant of defense, at first without at last against their prince. If sovereign right by sovereign power they scan, the same bold maxim holds in God and man. God were not safe, his thunder could they shun. He should be forced to crown another son. Thus when the heir was from the vineyard thrown, the rich possession was the murderer's own. In vain to sophistry they have recourse. By proving theirs no plot they prove 'tis worse. Unmasked rebellion and audacious force, which though not actual, yet all eyes may see, 'tis working in the immediate power to be. For from pretended grievances they rise, first to dislike and after to despise, then cyclope-like in human flesh to deal, chop up a minister at every meal, perhaps not wholly to melt down the king, but clip his regal rights within the ring, from thence to assume the power of peace and war, and ease him by degrees of public care. Yet to consult his dignity and fame, he should have leave to exercise the name, and hold the cards while commons played the game. For what can power give more than food and drink? To live at ease and not be bound to think. These are the cooler methods of their crime, but their hot zealots think 'tis loss of time. On utmost bounds of loyalty they stand, and grin and whet like a Croatian band that waits impatient for the last command. Thus outlaws open villainy maintain. They steal not, but in squadrons scour the plain, and if their power the passengers subdue, the most have right, the wrong is in the few. Such impious axioms foolishly they show, for in some soils republics will not grow. Our temperate isle will no extremes sustain of popular sway or arbitrary reign, but slides between them both into the best, secure in freedom in a monarch blessed. And though the climate vexed with various winds works through our yielding bodies on our minds, the wholesome tempest purges what it breeds, to recommend the calmness that succeeds. But thou the pander of the people's hearts, O crooked soul and serpentine in arts, whose blandishments a loyal land have whored, and broke the bonds she plighted to her lord. What curses on thy blasted name will fall, which age to age their legacy shall call? For all must curse the woes that must descend on all. Religion thou hast none, thy mercury has passed through every sect, or theirs through thee. But what thou givest, that venom still remains, and the poxed nation feels thee in their brains. What else inspires the tongues and swells the breasts of all thy bellowing renegado priests, that preach up thee, for God dispense thy laws, and with thy stum ferment their fainting cause? Fresh fumes of madness raise and toil and sweat, to make the formidable cripple great. Yet should thy crime succeed, should lawless power compass those ends, thy greedy hopes devour. Thy canting friends, thy mortal foes would be. Thy God and theirs will never long agree. For thine, if thou hast any, must be one. That lets the world and humankind alone. A jolly God that passes ours too well to promise heaven or threaten us with hell. That unconcerned can at rebellion sit and wink at crimes he did himself commit. A tyrant theirs the heaven their priesthood paints, a conventicle of gloomy sullen saints, a heaven like Bedlam slovenly and sad, foredoomed for souls with false religion mad. Without a vision poets can foreshow what all but fools by common sense may know. If true succession from our isle should fail, and crowds profane with impious arms prevail, not thou nor those thy factious arts engage shall reap that harvest of rebellious rage, with which thou flatterest thy decrepit age, the swelling poison of the several sects, which wanting vent the nation's health infects, shall burst its bag and fighting out their way, the various venoms on each other prey. The presbyter puffed up with spiritual pride shall on the necks of the lewd nobles ride, his brethren damn, the civil power defy, and parcel out republic prelacy. But short shall be his reign, his rigid yoke, and tyrant power will puny sects provoke, and frogs and toads and all the tadpole train will croak to heaven for help from this devouring crane. The cutthroat sword and clamorous gown shall jar in sharing their ill-gotten spoils of war. Chiefs shall be grudged the part which they pretend, lords envy lords, and friends with every friend about their impious merit shall contend. The surly commons shall respect deny, and jostle peerage out with property. Their general either shall his trust betray, and force the crowd to arbitrary sway, or they suspecting his ambitious aim, in hate of kings shall cast anew the frame, and thrust out collating that bore their name. Thus in born broils the factions would engage, or wars of exiled heirs or foreign rage, till halting vengeance overtook our age, and our wild labors, wearied into rest, reclined us on a rightful monarch's breast. Pudit HC opprobria vobis, et disai patuus et non patuus refelli. Note on the medal. Note Roman 1, the Polish medal p. 431. It was a standing joke among the opponents of Shaftesbury that he hoped to be chosen King of Poland at the vacancy when John Sobieski was elected. This was probably only a revival and new edition of an improbable story that he expected Cromwell would have made him King of England. His supposed election, its causes and effects, are very humorously stated in a pamphlet republished among Lord Somers' tracts, already quoted pp. 263-358. The author complains, ironically, that among the advantages of court favor, which Lord Shaftesbury had renounced for his country, already enumerated by one of his adherents, he had omitted to mention a yet more dignified sacrifice. I suppose there are very few in this kingdom that do not very sensibly remember the late interregnum in Poland, and how many illustrious candidates stood fair for the election. Sobieski, indeed, had done great things for that people. He had kept their potent enemy, the Turk, from entering any farther upon their frontier, was great and popular in the esteem and love of the best army that perhaps they ever had, but that was by much too little to entitle him to the succession of the throne, it appearing absolutely the interest of that nation that the great Turk was not only to be beaten, but he must in short also be converted, and who so fit for such an enterprise as he that should be promoted to the regal authority one, that from the high place he was to possess might not only administer justice to them, but salvation to the greater part of Asia. Upon these considerations, you may imagine quickly, the eyes of the whole Diet were cast upon Little England, and thereupon, whom so soon as the little Lord of Shaftesbury Polish deputies were immediately sent post incognito, with the imperial crown and scepter in a cloak-bag to him, old blood smelled it from Bishopgate Street, and had it not been for an old acquaintance and friendship between King Anthony, The elect for now, I must call him so, and himself, I am credibly informed, he had laid an ambush for it at the Cock Ale-house by Temple Bar, where some 30 indigent bullies were eating stuffed beef helter-skelter at his charge on purpose to stand by and assist him at carrying off the booty. But heaven, which I hope has ordained that no crown shall ever suffer damage for King Anthony's sake, took care to preserve this for the sinister designs of the old Irish crownmonger, being yet to be doubted this prudent prince, as I am told, having tried and fitted it to his head, carefully sent it back again by a trusty messenger concealed in the husk or shell of a Holland cheese, taken asunder merely for that purpose, and cemented again together by an art fit for no man to know but a king presumptive of Poland. All things thus prepared, his election being carried in the Diet so unanimously and so contradicent that no man to this hour ever heard of it but himself. It is not to be imagined how this little Grig was transported with the thoughts of growing into a Leviathan. He fancied himself the picture before Hobbes' Commonwealth. Already, nay, he stopped up his tap, as I am told, on purpose that his dropsy might swell him big enough for his majesty, and of a sudden grew so utter an enemy to all republics and anti-monarchical constitutions, that from that hour he premeditated and laid the foundation of a worse speech than that famous one which he once uttered in our English Senate, delenda est Carthago. But now, upon deliberate and weighty consideration of the great change, he was to undertake many difficulties, and of an extraordinary nature seemed to arise. A Protestant king being elected to a popish kingdom, great were the debates within himself, which way he was to steer his course in the administration of his government, so as to discharge his conscience, as well in the case incumbent upon him of the souls of his people, as of the protection of their properties and persons. The great Turk you have heard before was to be converted now. To bring so mighty a potentate over to the Church of Rome seemed altogether destructive of the Protestant interest, for which he has been always so violent a champion. Therefore it is resolved Protestant, and true Protestant, the Ottoman Emperor must be, or nothing. But how, when that was done to establish the same church in his dominions, there was the great question whereupon, after due consideration, he resolved at his taking possession of that throne, which stood gaping for him to carry over from hence such ministers both of church and state as might be proper to advise, assist, and support him in a design so pious, though so difficult. A list is therefore made out of Shaftesbury's real or supposed adherents, with absurd Polish terminations attached to their names, to whom what the satirist deemed suitable offices in King Anthony's court are respectively assigned. Among these, the reader will be startled to find our author himself under the following entry. John Dryden is our poet laureate for writing panegyrics upon Oliver Cromwell and libels against his present master, King Charles Roman II of England. Tom Shadworski, his deputy. From which it appears that Dryden, at the time of this pasquinade's being written, was considered as disaffected to the court. The joke of Shaftesbury's election to the Polish throne, having been once thrown out, was echoed and reechoed through 100 ballads, till it ceased to be a joke at all. The reader must have frequently remarked such allusions. We have, for instance, the following songs: Dagon's Fall, or the Whig's Lament for Anthony, King of Poland, 3d February 16,823. A new song on the King of Poland and the Prince of the Land of Promise. The poet's address to His Most Sacred Majesty, 6th July 1682. The Polish prince is charmed, he scorns weak buff. Consciences of impenetrable stuff. Note Roman 2, El Tama, which in Polish is Rejoice be 431. It would seem that the followers of Shaftesbury wore the medal attached to their breast, see a panegyric on their Royal Highnesses, and congratulating his return from Scotland, 1682. El Tamer is the word, a word which late, as mighty hopes did mighty joy create, when the famed motto with applause was put to the effigy of the grand patriot, nearest their heart where late their Georges hung. The pale-faced medal with its silver tongue was placed, whilst every wearer still expressed his joy to harbour there so famed a guest. The wretch that stamped it got immortal fame. 'Twas coined by stealth, like groats at Brummagem, while each possessor, with exalted voice, cries England saved, and now let us rejoice. Note Roman 3, a martial hero, first with early care, blown like a pygmy by the winds to war. A beardless chief, a rebel ere a man. So young his hatred to his prince began. P. 432. Dryden does not here do justice to Shaftesbury, who certainly offered Charles Roman I the first fruits of his courage and address, being heir to a plentiful fortune, a member of Parliament, and High Sheriff of the county of Dorset. He came to Oxford when the Civil War broke out, and though then only 21 or 22 years of age, presented to the king a digested plan for compromising matters between him and his subjects in arms against him. Charles observed, he was a very young man for so great an undertaking, to which, with the readiness which marked his character, he answered, that would not be the worse for the king's affairs, provided the business was done. He had in consequence a commission from the king to promise indemnity and redress of grievances to such of the parliamentary garrisons as would lay down their arms accordingly. His plan seems to have taken some effect, for Weymouth actually surrendered to the king, and Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, as his style then was made governor. Some delays occurred in the course of his obtaining this office, and whether disgusted with these, and giving scope to the natural instability of his temper, as is intimated by Clarendon, or offended, as Mr. Locke states, at Weymouth, having been plundered by Prince Maurice's forces, he made one of those sudden turns of which his political career furnishes several instances, and went over to the other side. After this, Clarendon says that he gave up himself body and soul to the Parliament, and became an implacable enemy to the royal family. He raised forces in Dorsetshire, with which he took Wareham by storm in October 1644, and reduced the greater part of the county to the obedience of the Parliament. He held various high charges under the authority of the Republic. In 1645, he was Sheriff of Norfolk, in 1646, Sheriff of Wiltshire, and in 1651, one of that committee which was named for the revisal and reform of the law. Note Roman 4, a vermin, wriggling in the usurer's ear. P. 432. Shaftesbury was by no means in a hurry to submit to Cromwell's domination, any more than he had been to join the Parliament, the uncontrolled authority of an individual, and of one too, who was inaccessible to all arts of cajoling or management, and only acted upon his own opinions and impulses, presented to the art and ambition of our statesmen a very unpromising field of exertion. Accordingly, he is said to have been active in opposing the dispossession of the Long Parliament, and being a member of that convoked by the Protector in 1656, he signed the famous protestation against the personal usurpation of Cromwell, which occasioned a very sudden dissolution of that assembly. But notwithstanding this occasional opposition, he sat in all Cromwell's parliaments, was a member of his Privy Council, and was so far in his favor that he is said by his enemies to have nourished hopes of succeeding him in his power, with which view he aimed to become his son-in-law. Hence, he is called in the Dream of the Cabal a little bobtailed Lord Urchin of State, a praise-a-god barebone peer whom all men hate. State Poems, Vol. Roman 1 p. 148. Note Roman 5, he cast himself into the saint-like mold, groaned, sighed, and prayed, while godliness was gain, the loudest bagpipe of the squeaking train, but as 'tis hard to cheat a juggler's eyes, his open lewdness he could ne'er disguise. P. 432. According to North, the Earl of Shaftesbury in all his ways and workings held a concert with the anti-monarchists and fanatics. As to his dissipation, the well-known speech of Charles Roman II and his reply are sufficient evidence. I believe Shaftesbury, said the gay monarch, thou art the wickedest dog in England. May it please your majesty, retorted the statesman of a subject, I believe I am North, the recorder of all that was evil concerning him, says, whether out of inclination, custom, or policy I will not determine it, is certain he was not behindhand with the court in the modest pleasures of the time, and to what excess of libertinism they were commonly grown is no secret. There was a deformed old gentleman called Sir Paul Neale, who they say sat for the picture of Sidrophil in Hudibras, and about town was called the Lord Shaftesbury's groom, because he watered his mares, I forbear the vulgar word, in Hyde Park with Rhenish wine and sugar, and not seldom a bait of cheesecakes. Note Roman 6 power was his aim, but thrown from that pretense. The wretch turned loyal in his own defense, and malice reconciled him to his Principe 432. Whatever Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper's private political principles might be, he failed not to take a share of power upon the changes which so rapidly succeeded the death of Cromwell under the Rump Parliament. He was one of the Council of State and a commissioner for managing the army, one of the committee to secure the tower and colonel of a regiment of horse. He made use of the influence which these situations afforded him for hastening the Restoration. Sir Anthony had long held a secret correspondence with the loyal party, and was to have joined Sir George Booth at his rising, had he not been so suddenly crushed. He was taxed with this intended cooperation in Parliament, but he was at least resolved not to bear witness against himself, for he made the highest professions of his innocence, and imprecated God's judgments on him and his posterity if he had the slightest communication with the king or his friends. Nevertheless, he was one of those who invited Monk into England, was the first to supply him with a regiment of horse, was active in defeating the schemes of Lambert, and in conclusion was named one of the 12 members who were deputed by the House of Commons to invite the king to return to his dominions. Note Romans 7. Him in the anguish of his soul he served, rewarded faster still than he deserved. Behold him now exalted into Trust P 432. At the time of His Majesty's Restoration, as a most signal testimony of His Majesty's good sentiments of his former actions, Shaftesbury was advanced to be one of the first rank in His Majesty's most honourable Privy Council, and was placed above His Majesty's royal brother the Duke of Gloucester, and even General Monk himself, whom His Majesty used to call his political father. And about 3 days before His Majesty's coronation, he was in the banqueting house created Baron Ashley of Wimborne St. Giles, and another addition. Honour was conferred on him Lord Cooper of Paulet, and at last in the year 1672 he was made Earl of Shaftesbury. At the same time, when Duke Lauderdale, the Earl of Arlington, and the Lord Clifford were promoted to these honours, were added substantial power and weight in the administration called the Cabal, from the initial letters of the ministers' names who composed it. In this ministry, Shaftesbury was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and on the resignation of Lord Keeper Bridgeman, became Lord High Chancellor of England. This high station he furthered with all his policy and eloquence the union with France against Holland, and the breach of the Triple League fatal measures, which tended to the destruction of our natural barrier against the universal dominion of France. It is probable that Shaftesbury's ardent spirit flattered itself with the hopes of conducting a popular and triumphant war, but whatever were his motives, let it be remembered to his honour that French bribery, so common among the British ministers of the period, had no influence with Shaftesbury, whether he found the war ill managed by the court and ill relished by the nation was likely to do very little honour to those who had pushed it on, or whether he was dissatisfied with the share he enjoyed of the king's favour, or finally, whether distrusting the easiness and mutability of the king's temper, is absolutely uncertain, but moved either by these or more patriotic motives, Shaftesbury, in the Parliament of 16,723, although in office, showed himself prepared to join opposition on very short notice. Note Roman 8, but when this fatal council found too late, exposed its author to the public hate, when his just sovereign, by no impious way, could be seduced to arbitrary sway, forsaken of that hope, he shifts his sail, drives down the current with a popular gale, and shows the fiend confessed without a veil. P 433. Two circumstances seem chiefly to have influenced Shaftesbury in his change of politics. In 1672, some vacancies had occurred in the House of Commons during a recess of Parliament. These his lordship, as Chancellor, had caused to be filled up by issuing writs for election of his own authority, without waiting for the Speaker's warrant of proceeding, which was deemed by the House an undue exertion of prerogative, and the elections were declared irregular and null. This greatly irritated Shaftesbury's haughty temper, who thought the Crown did not support him with sufficient energy in a step which he had taken to extend its influence. From this, he judged that the king had not energy sufficient to venture upon bold measures, and consequently that there was no room for the game of a minister who delighted in bold and masterly strokes of policy. But this was yet more to be inferred from the king's conduct in the matter of the indulgence. This was a declaration which the king, by advice of Shaftesbury and his other ministers, had sent forth on the 25th March, 1672, dispensing with the penal laws against nonconformists of every description, and indulging to Protestant dissenters the public, and to Catholics the private exercise of their religious worship. It is remarkable that Shaftesbury, afterwards the champion for the test against popery, was made chancellor chiefly for the purpose of affixing the Great Seal to this declaration, which the Lord Keeper Bridgeman refused to do. The House of Commons remonstrated against this exercise of prerogative. After an inefficient struggle, Charles recalled the declaration and broke the seals with his own hand. From that moment Shaftesbury declared that the king had forsaken himself, and deserved to be forsaken, suspicious that a monarch who preferred so evidently his peace and pleasures to his prerogative would not hesitate to make the lesser sacrifice of an obnoxious minister, anxious also on account of the preponderance of the Duke of York, who hated him and whom he hated. The Chancellor probably foresaw that in making an apparent sacrifice of court favor, he would not only save himself, but become the leader instead of being the victim of the popular faction. Accordingly, he promoted the Test Act in the House of Commons, and stood forth in the House of Lords as the leader of the Protestant party, whom the declaration had grievously alarmed. From so unexpected a change at this eventful period, his removal from office was a matter of course. But in the mode of accomplishing it, circumstances occurred which strongly marked the character of Shaftesbury, who delighted in an opportunity of teasing and alarming his enemies, even in the very act of retreating before them. When he waited upon the king to surrender the seals, he observed a circle of his enemies in the antechamber, anticipating with triumph his returning without these badges of his office. Upon obtaining his audience, the falling minister begged the king that his dismissal might be so arranged as not to appear as it he was thrown off with contempt. "Godsfish," replied the good-natured monarch, "I will not do it with any circumstance that looks like an affront." The earl then begged permission to carry the seals before the king to chapel, and return them afterwards from his house. His boon being granted, he carried on the conversation with much humor upon such gay subjects as usually entertained the king, while his adversaries, upon the tenterhooks of anxiety, awaited the issue of so long an audience. But when they saw the king and the chancellor come out together smiling, and go in company to the chapel, the party concluded Shaftesbury's peace was made, and his expected successor was inconsolable. After enjoying this little triumph, Shaftesbury sent the seals to the king, and placed himself at the head of the country party, who, from the general and well-founded opinion of his talents, did not hesitate to adopt as their leader one who had just deserted the banners of the enemy. From this time Shaftesbury must always be considered as in opposition to the court, for although a number of the country party were admitted into the Council of State, formed by the advice of Temple, and Shaftesbury himself was president, he was in fact no more united to the king's party than a detachment of besiegers become a part of the garrison of a besieged town, because a bastion or redoubt has been surrendered to them by capitulation. Note Roman 9, thus men are raised by factions and decried, and rogue and saint distinguished by their side. P. 435. This was the argument concerning the credibility of the plot witnesses, which was so triumphantly urged by the Tories, who asked, "Are not these men good witnesses, upon whose testimony Stafford and so many Catholics have been executed, and whom you yourselves have so long celebrated as men of credit and veracity? You have admitted them into your bosom. They are best acquainted with your treasons. They are determined in another shape to serve their king and country, and you cannot complain that the same measure which you meted to others should now by a righteous doom of vengeance be measured out to you." To this there was but one answer: we have been duped by our own prejudices and the perjury of these men, but you, by employing against us witnesses whom you know to be forsworn villains, and whom their versatility has sufficiently proved to be such, are doing with your eyes open what we did in the blindness of prejudice, and are worse than us, as guilt is worse than folly. But this, though the Whigs' true defense required a candid disavowal of the popish plot and reprobation of the witnesses, and that no true Protestant would submit to. Note Roman 10, thy military chiefs are brave and true, nor are thy disenchanted burghers few. The head is loyal, which thy heart commands. But what's a head with two such gouty hands? P. 436. As matters carried more and more the appearance of actual insurrection and civil war, the more wealthy of the citizens of London, to whom nothing could be more ruinous than such an event, began to draw to the royal party. They were grieved also that the ancient course of feasting and hospitality observed by former sheriffs had given way for furious cabals in coffee-houses, and by degrees a large body of citizens who had, according to North, good hearts and good spirits, were formed for the purpose of restoring the ancient order and course of living in the city. By means of this party Sir John Moore was elected Lord Mayor, for whose character and conduct, and that of Shute and Pilkington, the Whig sheriffs, whom Dryden here terms his two gouty hands, see the two last notes on the second part of Absalom, and Achitophel pp. 401-403, it was a great advantage to the court that the military chiefs of the city Roman 1e, the officers of the train bands Roman 100, were attached to the royal cause, and it was very much by their emphatic interference that the election of sheriffs for 1683 was carried against the Whig party. Note Roman 11, perhaps not wholly to melt down the king, but clip his regal rights within the ring. P. 437. Until 1663 milled money was not struck in England, and the hammered coin which continued to be in circulation long after that period was liable to be clipped, which occasioned great frauds on the public and loss to individuals. It is remarkable that the verses which follow describing the cipher-like state of royalty to which the country party wished to reduce the king agree accurately with what North believed to be Shaftesbury's real designs upon the authority and person of Charles, if he was really a friend to any humankind besides himself. I believe it was to King Charles II, whose gaiety breeding wit, good humor, familiarity, and disposition to enjoy the pleasures of society and greatness engaged him very much, that had a great share of wit, agreeableness, and gallantry himself. But this same superiority spoiled all his majesty, would not always be influenced by him, but would take short turns on his toe, and so frustrate his projects, and finding by that he could not work under him, he strove if possible to reduce his authority and get above him. It seems by what was given out that he would not have hurt the king personally, but kept him tame in a cage with his ordinary pleasures about him. And if he was privy to the cruel stroke intended at the Rye, or any way concurring it, was the necessity of affairs, such as are laws to a politician and superior to all human engagements, that obliged him. And of that sort the chief was self-preservation, for though he had found the king very easily reconciled, as not being in his nature vindicative, it was possible that humor as age advanced might spend, and he had launched so deep in treason, as it seemed necessary that either the king or he should fall. Examen p. 119. Note Roman 12, what else inspires the tongues and swells the breasts of all thy bellowing renegado priests? P. 438. The keen and violent attack made upon the dissenting and fanatical clergy in these and the following lines called forth the indignation of the famous Edmund Hickeringill, who had been originally one of Cromwell's fighting saints, was at this time rector of All Saints in Colchester, and was notorious for composing fanatical pamphlets, songs, and sermons. This reverend gentleman did not let the sun go down without venting his ire, for the very next day after the publication of the medal he sent to the press an answer to it entitled The Mushroom, or a Satire against Libeling Tories and Prelatical Tantivies, in answer to a satire against sedition, called The Medal by the author of Absalom and Achitophel, and here answered by the author of The Black Nonconformist the next day after the publication of the medal, to keep the sale thereof. To this unintelligible title page succeeds a prefatory epistle, and a poem almost equally unintelligible, as will appear from a few extracts. Epistle to the Tories and Tantivies, instead of an epistle to you Tories. I'll only preface here with some old stories. About the year of our Lord 1218 at Paris, in a synod or convocation of the clergy, one that was appointed to Clarum or preach, the convocation sermon was put to his trumps, and much troubled in his gizzard what to say, or what subject to insist upon, whereupon the devil, who always catches men napping, and observing the preacher to be melancholy and perplexed in mind, appears to him as he sat in a brown study, and asked him why he was so careful what to preach. Say, thus quoth the devil, the princes of hell salute you, O the princes and prelates of the church, and gladly give you thanks that through your default and negligence all souls go to hell. Roman 100 Roman 100 Roman 100. You call the popes hard names, bears, wolves, and shirks. For mischief, what is then the bishop and his clerks? At the land's end of England, those dire stones, on which ships' men are lost body and bones. The poem itself begins thus. Time was John Laureate when thy pretty muse, young, plump, and buxom, no man would refuse, though thou didst poorly prostitute her store, and for vile pence made her a hackney whore. Against the rules of art bus is just. Her former lovers does her now disgust, and I that once in private loved her well, nay, sometimes smiled at her a chit awful. I long to kiss her kindly and to greet her loving airs so charming and so sweet. Nay, be not jealous, John, thou hast no cause. This was whilst she, within the modest laws of a true poet, kept she's nauseous grown. Thou needs must blush to own her for thine own. If thou has any grace, she's poor and spent, so far from witty that grows impudent. Oh, what a silly do thou kept'st in vain about a medal, thus to break thy brain. The ancient Romans, so renowned for wars, kept medals of their friends and ancestors. Art thou, red litter bred of hopes from Rome, yet against pictures speak'st from whence they come? A satyr, once satyrs could speak ere thine. Why men did blow their nails could not divine, nor why they did their porridge blow was told. One was to make them hot, the other cold. At which news satyr set up scut and run, as if he had been frighted with a gun. How would he run from the naked truth, who blowst both hot and cold from the same mouth? The mushroom concludes with the following awful threat, which doubtless must have greatly appalled Dryden. I'll take thy laurels from thee, if I list, an honor to my fairer brow when missed. 'Tis a day thrown away, no more think I, no more it was yetdom perdidi, unless it be to make thy satire fell. And Tonson begged this boon which some think well. Thy satire 3 months old, a cripple came. This day to hand, I now return it lame. London, March 17, 1681. The ingenious author tacks to his poem some rants of inimitable nonsense and scurrility, in prose, in which he is pleased to intimate that there is, from the wonderful celerity of its production, some ground for believing that he himself, the author, had received miraculous aid. And if any man think or say that it is a wonder if this book and verses were composed and writ in one day, and sent to the press, since it would employ the pen of a ready writer to copy this book in a day, it may be so. But it is a truth as certain and stable as the sun in the firmament, and which, if need be, the bookseller, printer, and other worthy citizens that are privy to it, can avouch for an infallible truth. Dio soli gloriohen. A divine hand assists one of despicable, dull, and inconsiderate parts, may do wonders, which God usually performs by most weak and unlikely instruments. A single extract more may be added to show the high popularity of Absalom and Achitophel among the country gentlemen of England. What sport it is to see an old country justice, with his eager chaplain at his elbow, putting his barnacles on his nose, bless us how he gapes, and admires Nat Thompson, the addresses in the Gazette, abhorrences Heraclitus, or the Observator, but show him but Absalom and Achitophel. Then the man's horn mad, there's no holding him, then he hunts up, and though in his dinning room how he spends with double mouth, and whoops and hallows, just as he hunts his dogs, when at full cry that, rattle tozer bulldog thunder that, while the little trencher chaplain echoes to him and cries Amen. Note Roman 13, with which thou flatterest thy decrepit HP 439. Shaftesbury was at this period little above 60 years old, but he was in a state of premature decrepitude, partly owing to natural feebleness of body, and partly to an injury which he received by an overturn in a Dutch carriage when he was in Holland in 1660 as one of the parliamentary committee. He received on this occasion a wound or bruise in his side, which came to an internal exulceration, so that in the year 1672 he was opened by Mr. Knowles the surgeon under the direction of Dr. Willis, and an issue inserted for the regular discharge of the humor. This one of his biographers has called the greatest cure that ever was done on the body of man. The royalists forgot the honorable cause, in which this injury was received, nothing less than a journey undertaken to invite the king to repossession of his throne, when they made its consequences the subject of scurrilous jests. Dryden had already called Shaftesbury the formidable cripple, and in the essay of satire he sarcastically describes the contrast between the activity of his spirit and the decrepitude of his person. The end of the 9th volume.